Galactic Rift, Mage Saga Book 8, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 21. It was 3 a.m, and Carina's foot was aflame by the time she reached the hotel with Pamuk and her other partners in crime. The walk back to Laft had been brutal. As well as the pulse round burn she'd suffered, Pamuk had badly twisted her ankle jumping from the window. With the 2 of them injured, their journey had been slow, and the need to avoid detection meant they'd stayed far from the highway. Stray rocks and spoil from tunnelling littered the open ground. Each time Carina had tripped on something, the agony that lanced from her burnt foot was indescribable. The streets of Laft were empty at the late hour. They'd walked from the edge of town to the hotel without encountering another soul. As Carina mounted the steps to the lobby, she nursed a hope they might have gotten away with their escapade. In the back of her mind, she knew she was being delusional, but the pain and the long trek had addled her mind. Vice-General Quesham was waiting for them. The sadistic glitter in her eyes told Carina she'd seen them approach. She'd probably had tabs on them ever since they'd stepped within Laft's boundaries, but she'd let them walk the remaining kilometres exhausted and injured, prolonging their suffering out of spite. Soldiers waited inside the door. The black dogs who had remained behind stood on the staircase watching. "Seize them," Quesham ordered. "Search them and then bring them to me, along with anything you find." Firm hands grasped Carina's arms and she was force-marched away from the entrance. She didn't have the strength or willpower to put up a fight. Vigo's body in the dust below the mansion's window was an image she couldn't banish from her mind. Limply, she allowed herself to be manhandled. The soldiers slapped and jabbed her as they searched. When they came up empty-handed, she was the first to be taken to Quesham. The Vice-General was seated at the hotel manager's desk. After running her gaze from Carina's toes to her head, she nodded at the soldier who had brought her in. The man left. "Your companion is dead," said Quesham. "I thought so. The guards at the Varvara estate didn't know he was an outsider before they shot him. They thought you were there for a purpose other than stealing the family's valuables. It was night time and the room you were in was dark, so they didn't notice the colour of your friend's clothes. It was an easy mistake to make. They will be punished nevertheless." "Because they shot one of us?" She was confused. If the guards' employers didn't want them to use deadly force on intruders, why did they give them guns? "Because they killed an outsider." "I didn't realise we were so important." Quesham slammed her hands on the desk and rose stiffly to her feet. She walked around the desk and up to Carina before leaning in until their noses nearly touched. "You didn't realise you were important? What the hell do you think has been happening here?" "I don't know. You tell me. You've all been screwing around with us ever since you took us prisoner." Quesham moved away. "But you've been treated well. You can't deny it. Believe me, things could be a lot worse for you. Doesn't matter how well you treated us. We're still prisoners. If you're so nice and kind, let us go. Give us our ship back." Carina paused as a fresh wave of pain from her foot washed over her. "What do you mean things could be a lot worse? Are you talking about the rest of us, the ones you took to the other zones? What have you been doing to them?" It hadn't occurred to her, after Rano had told her that her siblings were in another zone, that their experience of Sotloza might be different from hers. Sudden fear seized her, masking the discomfort from her injury. "If you want to treat us well, let us see the rest of our ship's personnel. How do we know you haven't killed them?" Amusement flickered over the Vice-General's face. "No one's been killed." "I don't believe you. I want to see them." If you had been compliant, that might have been arranged, but now it's out of the question. You've demonstrated that you can't be trusted. We can't take the risk." "Compliant with what?" Carina spat. "What are we supposed to be complying with?" "You could start by not breaking into highly respected families' homes and stealing from them. What was it you took, by the way? Is another member of your gang carrying the item?" Carina didn't answer. After a moment's silence, Quesham returned to her seat. "Oh well, I'll find out soon enough. The Vavara family will take an inventory and figure it out. What I don't understand is, why do it in the first place? What use would you have for a valuable item? You lack the connections to make profit from it." Carina only regarded her steadily. Quesham sighed and shook her head. "Naturally, your actions mean freedom of movement is now restricted for all outsiders. No one can leave this hotel unless accompanied by a Sotlosen with the necessary clearance. I will send a medic to your room to attend to your injury." This seemed to be a dismissal, so Carina limped out into the lobby. Pamuk was waiting with 2 soldiers. They exchanged a look as Carina passed by. "I'm gonna kill Chertang when I see him," Pamuk seethed. "Slowly." She was lying in her bed across the room from Carina, her ankle wrapped up. A medic had attended to Carina's foot too, and she was in less physical pain. She was lying on her side, facing the merc. She was angry with Chertang too, but even if he had met them in the hall as planned, things would probably have gone the same way. "We should have closed the front door," she replied dully. "Huh? If we'd closed the front door, the guards wouldn't have come into the house until later, after someone heard the noise of the cabinet breaking. Maybe they wouldn't have heard it at all, and we could have snuck away. There's no point in speculating, but Chertang might have thought to close the door. He deviated from the plan like a moron. He isn't a merc, just an engineer, and a young one. He's older than you." Carina had no answer to this. Their pickup from Lakshmi was older, in his early 20s, yet in many ways he was younger than her, young and naive. We might not see him again anyway. He could have already shacked up with his new girlfriend. It'll be lucky for him if he does. Carina understood how Pamuk felt. To be betrayed by a teammate was devastating and infuriating, especially when someone died. If Chertang had been a black dog and had no excuse for his behaviour, at the very best he could have expected a severe beating. But she couldn't share Pamuk's anger. She was too heartsick for Bryce, her brothers and sisters, and Vigo. Over their time on Lakshmi Station, the Lotta Krillin had become a friend. She had lost too many friends. "What do you think was wrong with that person in the bed?" Pamuk asked. "No idea." Carina turned onto her back. Whatever it was bad. They looked barely alive. "Yeah, and they weren't going to get any better. No one comes back from that. If I'm ever like that, I hope someone does a favour and pulls the plug." "Me too. I don't get it though. Why wasn't that person in hospital? Why were they being kept in that room? They'd been brought home to die, of course. The same thing happened to my uncle. He lived on Ithia and caught the plague. When he got too sick and the splicers couldn't help him anymore, my cousins took him home so he could die in peace, surrounded by the people he loved." Carina turned onto her side again to stare at Pamuk. "Your uncle had Ithian plague? You've heard of it?" "Yeah, It was the disease Ma had died of, and that Bryce had suffered from until his parents found him and paid for his treatment. But she didn't want to go into personal history. I've heard of it. I'm sorry." "Don't worry about it. We weren't close." A fellow merc stuck his head in. "Chertang's back." Pamuk leapt from her bed and then gave a yelp as her twisted ankle hit the floor. "I'm gonna kill him." I'm gonna throttle his goddamn scrawny neck. She hobbled out. Pamuk, slow down, Carina called after her. At least wait to hear what he has to say. She hopped across the room, grabbing the doorframe for support, and leaned into the corridor. Pamuk had reached the end of it and was face to face with Chertang, hands on hips, though not yet hurting him. He appeared terrified, justifiably. Carina was a bit scared of Pamuk too, and she hadn't done anything to piss her off. "Where were you?" Pamuk demanded. "We had to find that goddamn room all by ourselves." Chertang stammered. Cheapy woke up and came downstairs. I had to go back up with her. She wouldn't wait for me. You could have put her off, told her a lie or something. She wouldn't take no for an answer. I can't help it if I'm irresistible. Pamuk's fury dissolved and she let out a great guffaw. Roaring with laughter, she collapsed to the floor and slapped it, wheezing out, "Someone help me! I'm gonna piss myself!" Boots hammered on the stairs. Someone was running up. Someone in a hurry. Pamuk and Chertang turned toward the interruption. A merc ran from the stairwell and down the corridor, carrying something in his hands. Wordlessly, he handed it to Carina. It was the bowl. They'd stashed it among some rubble as they'd made their way back. She took it into her room and held it up to the window. It was risky. She suspected their every move was being watched, but she had to know. Pamuk appeared at her side, along with Chertang and the merc who had brought the bowl. She ran her fingertips over the dark brown surface, judged the weight of the thing, and peered closely at it. The bowl was utterly smooth with no blemish. There was also no sign of the grain she expected in a wooden object. She turned the bowl over. A maker's mark had been stamped into the underside. The stamp was clearly melted into the material. Her legs lost their strength and she slumped to the bed. The bowl toppled from her hands. It isn't made from wood. Chapter 22. Unless she was with a Sot Lozen, Carina couldn't leave the hotel. After a restless night, she'd spent the next day in the lounge. It was dusk, yet she hadn't eaten anything since returning from the raid, and even now she didn't feel hungry. They had gone to all that effort, suffered injuries, and lost Vigo for nothing. It had all been a waste of time. A couple of black dogs were here too, puzzling over the content on an interface. To her disgust, she realized they were trying to figure out the meanings of words in the Sot Lozen language. She turned from them to stare morosely out the window. Pedestrians passed on the street, some giving the hotel glances. The prisoner's new location was famous. Was the burglary popular news as well? She didn't care. She felt like she was standing at the bottom of a pit. Up above was a circle of daylight, real daylight, not the Sot Lozen fake sky. And somewhere out there were all the people she loved. Yet the pit was deep and the sides were smooth. There was no way of getting out. "Someone wants to see you." The hotel receptionist stood in the doorway, disdain written on her features. Carina got to her feet. Who could it be? The only person she could think of was Rano Shelter. Was the security chief still interested in a relationship with her after her escapade? A spark of hope lighting up, she walked out into the lobby. Hedron Mafmi awaited her. She halted in her tracks. "It's Carina, isn't it?" "Yes." "I've come to take you on an excursion, if you're interested." There was something in Hedron's tone Carina couldn't define, and her expression was odd. Her face looked pinched, as if she was holding something in. Still, the only way Carina was going to get out of the hotel was in her company. Okay. She accompanied the Sot Lozen down the hotel steps. Her car was parked next to the curb. "Get in," Hedron said. It sounded like an order. Carina began to have second thoughts. "Are you coming with me or not?" Carina climbed into a front seat. Hedron input the destination. The car waited for the traffic to clear and then U-turned. They headed to the outskirts of Laft and then onto the highway to Sarnak. The drive would take them past the house she'd broken into, where Vigo had died. She didn't doubt this trip had something to do with him. Hedron hadn't spoken a word since leaving the hotel. The house appeared on the side of the road, enigmatic behind its fence. It was hard to imagine the previous night's events had taken place. She recalled the skinless figure with melted flesh, kept alive by machines. Hedron checked the road behind, reached out and pressed a button on the dashboard. The car slowed to a stop, its engine running. She pressed a second button, the dash opened, and a steering wheel emerged. Pedals rose from the floor. Taking the wheel, Hedron guided the car off the road and into the bare, undeveloped wasteland. A bad feeling crept over Carina. "Where are you taking me?" There was barely enough light to steer by, but Hedron must have done something to stop the vehicle turning on its headlights. She clearly didn't want to be seen from the road. "Stop," said Carina. "Let me out." She tried the door. It was locked. "Calm down. We're nearly there." Nearly where? There was nothing out here. Behind them, cars passed by, their occupants oblivious to the rogue vehicle. Carina pressed a pedal, drawing the car to a halt. "Have you ever been to the edge, Carina?" "The edge of what?" "Get out, and I'll show you." The door locks clicked open. Outside, the air had the same ambient temperature as always. It was dark, and the stars hadn't achieved their full brightness. "Walk that way," Hedron said. Carina could only just make out her arm and hand as she pointed. Keeping a wary eye on her, she stepped in the indicated direction. A few paces later, she walked right into a solid surface. She had reached the side of the tunnel. "That's the limit of this section," Hedron whispered in her ear. Carina jumped. The minute she'd stopped watching the Sot Lozen, she'd approached her closely. She turned. "Get away from me! Feel it! Feel the rock!" "Why? It's just rock. What are you doing?" "It isn't only rock. It's the substance that encloses my world. It's all around us, above, below, and on every side. Wherever we live, there it is. If we want to go somewhere new, we must bore it out, meter by arduous meter. I don't give a shit about your world. You're the ones choosing to live here. It's not my problem, or at least it wasn't until you made it my problem. If you finish the geology lesson, you can take me back to the hotel. I brought you here so you can see what it means to be Sot Lozen, to be always hemmed in, confined. Like I said, I don't give a shit." Hedron had made a quick movement. The glint of a blade flashed. Carina took a step back. She hit the wall. The car was on one side, the wall to her rear, and Hedron in front. The only way out lay to her left. Hedron moved up close. Her voice soft, she said, "You took it away from me. My only chance for life. The only way I would ever be able to create something beautiful. And now it's gone. Because of you." Her arm jerked upward. Carina knocked it to one side and grabbed Hedron's wrist. Her other hand came up to grasp Carina's neck. She headbutted her. Hedron gasped, and warm blood from her nose spattered Carina. Her free hand went to her face while she tried to wrench the knife-wielding arm from Carina's grip. Carina punched her jaw. She staggered backward. There was distance between them now, but they remained joined by Carina's hold on her right arm. Carina twisted her wrist. "Let go," she said through clenched teeth. "Let go of it." Hedren squealed with pain, but the knife remained in her hand. Carina kicked her. Another squeal. "If you don't let go, I'll break your fucking arm." The knife dropped. Carina released Hedren's wrist to pick it up. Instantly the woman ran. She leapt after her, launched herself at Hedren's back, and together they hit the ground. The whoosh of breath that escaped the Sotlozan's lungs said Hedren wouldn't be moving for a while. Carina felt for the knife in the dark. She found the blade first, slicing open her thumb. Cursing, she grabbed the handle. Hedren's silhouette had changed. She had turned onto her back and was lying still, gasping. Carina crawled over to her and knelt on her, a knee on each arm. She placed the tip of the knife at her throat. "Don't!" Hedren panted. "Please, don't! Tell me why your people brought us here. I want the truth, everything. Do you understand? I can't. I'm not allowed. You brought me to this place to kill me, which means no one's watching. There are no cameras, no microphones. I can do what I like. No one will come to help you. I can slit your throat and make it fast, or we can take it slow, one cut at a time, until, a few hours from now, you bleed out." It was like another person's words were coming from her mouth. Carina heard herself as if from a distance, or as if a stranger was talking, not her. It wasn't only the meaning of the words that shocked her inner self, it was the cruelty, the enjoyment in her voice. Her fears for her siblings and Bryce, and grief for Vigo, were sending her mad. "Please," Hedren whimpered. "Tell me." She pushed the knife tip in. Hedren screamed and writhed. "I'll tell you! I'll tell you!" Carina moved the blade away a fraction until it only rested on her skin. It's the radiation that does it. That's why we have to live underground. It isn't only because conditions on the surface are bad. It's just much safer down here anyway. But it doesn't give us complete protection. The radiation is too strong, and it seeps in too, in a gas from the rock. We have to keep the fans running all the time to extract it. Radiation? The idea had never occurred to her, but it explained one thing. I saw something. Someone. At that house we broke into. There was something very wrong with them. It was like their flesh was melting away. Was that radiation poisoning? Hedren nodded. You mean Nervavara. He spent too long on the surface, testing out a new idea for a habitation. It didn't work. He was stubborn, ignored all the warnings, and now he's dying. His family are keeping him alive as long as they can, but a lot of people think it's time he was put out of his misery. The guards thought you were fanatics, there to do what the family won't. That's why they have guards. They've received death threats, and not only for Ner. As Carina pondered this revelation, Hedren twisted under her. I've told you what you want to know. I want to go now. You haven't told me anything that explains why you brought us here, and why your people have done the same thing for centuries. I told you, it's the radiation. So what about the radiation? It kills us, young. Have you seen any really old people? Now Carina thought about it, she hadn't. I've only ever seen them in ancient vids and sims from the old planet. No one on Sotloza lives past 50. Only a few people make it that far. There are euthanasia clinics all over the place. Hedren still wasn't giving the full story. She was holding something back. But Carina had figured it out anyway. You can't have kids. She felt the other woman's body go limp. It's hard, said Hedren softly. Most of us freeze eggs or sperm soon after we start producing them, and they're stored in lead-lined vaults. Getting pregnant and growing a baby to full term are fraught with problems. So many fetuses die of medical complications or abnormalities before they're even born. If we can get fresh genetic material from people who haven't grown up saturated by radiation, it multiplies the chances of success. And the influx of new genes from off-world helps prevent us from becoming inbred. It was the real answer Carina had wanted ever since the attraction beam had fastened on the Bathsheba. Finally, things made sense. Except for one thing. Why don't you leave? This planet's a terrible place. The children you're so desperate to have will lead horrendous lives. Who would wish that on their child? It's all we have, Hedron exclaimed. It's everything our ancestors fought for. The reason they suffered and endured to give us life, a future. Her voice quiet again. Besides, if you grow up here, you're doomed before you reach adulthood. If I were to leave tomorrow, it wouldn't help me. Wherever I go, tumours will kill me before I grow old. She began to weep. Carina got to her feet. Keeping hold of the knife, she walked toward the road, the sound of Hedron's sobs growing fainter. Chapter 23. Parthenia's request that Bryce could live with the siblings and Ava had been denied, but he was allowed to visit, and he wasn't required to give any more samples. Only Rees had to attend the regular medical appointments. The merc predictably joked that it was because Bryce's donations weren't worth having. Bryce suspected it was rather that their captors didn't want him bruised and battered when Parthenia and the others saw him. For this latest visit, the children had managed to persuade the guards to allow him to accompany them on an excursion. Darius had done an excellent job of hanging on to the head guard's hand, looking up at him with puppy eyes and asking him plaintively if Uncle Bryce could come too. It was his first proper experience of the world outside the prison. As they walked down the street where the children lived, accompanied by armed escorts, it took a while for him to shake the impression he was on the surface. The Sot Lozans had done a good job with the sky. It appeared to stretch for kilometres, but it had to be only a short distance overhead. It wouldn't make any sense for it to be as high as it appeared. Tunnelling out the underground area would be time-consuming and expensive. The kids had been here long enough to have found favourite places to go. Their most favoured place was within walking distance. Parthenia stepped sedately beside him. Darius held his hand. Nala had elected to stay at home. She was learning Sot Loza's native language. It was typical of the smart little girl to seize the opportunity to learn something new, and her knowledge might come in useful. Passers-by took longer than necessary looks at the children. It wasn't so odd, considering 4 bodyguards surrounded them. Yet there seemed to be more than idle curiosity in their glances. In another context, Bryce might have said the onlookers appeared wistful or even hungry, as if Parthenia and the others were precious yet unattainable. They rounded a corner, and the place the children had picked for their outing came into view. It was the first sight of green Bryce had experienced in all his time on Sot Loza. Lush grass grew next to a wire fence and pushed through it, wild flowers dotted among the tall stalks. Another novelty hit his senses, the sound of children playing. "It isn't very nice being kept prisoner," Parthenia remarked. "But we love coming here," Oriana added. "It reminds us of the grounds of our estate on Ithia." "Where you lived with your father?" Bryce asked, surprised that she seemed to be making a happy association with her former home. "And Mother," Oriana replied, as if in explanation. "Mother was with us too." "I can see how hard it is for you to understand," Parthenia said. "But we do have happy memories of our childhood. It wasn't all bad. I think Mother shielded us from the worst of it. I know she did with the younger children. I remember more than they do. but even I recall some peaceful, pleasant times. Father wasn't always home, and when he was away, we were quite content. I miss Mother, Darius murmured. We all do, Parthenia interrupted. We all miss her. Another new sight opened up for Bryce. The park had the usual trees and flower beds, but it also contained low hillocks. Everything he'd seen on Sot Loza so far had been flat. In one section, a climbing wall rose about 15 meters, and children in safety harnesses were climbing it. There were adventure playgrounds with slides, ropes, bridges, tunnels, dens, swings, zip lines, and all the usual equipment. More children swarmed over it. Have you noticed it? Parthenia asked, spreading her arms wide. Noticed what? The breeze. She was right. A soft wind blew, rustling the grass, flowers, and leaves of the trees. There isn't a breath of movement in the air anywhere else. Because we're underground. There must be fans somewhere. Yes, said Fern, but we've never been able to discover them. Though the guards bring us here, they don't let us out of their sight for a minute, and they restrict where we can go. I would love to try the climbing wall, but they won't let me. They say it's too dangerous, said Oriana. But the other children are allowed on it. Indeed, only children were climbing, their parents watching anxiously from below. In fact, parents were everywhere, gazes fixed on their offspring. I only wish it were real, Parthenia remarked. What do you mean? The park seemed real enough to Bryce. Aside from the doting mothers and fathers, the place seemed very similar to parks on Ithia, and, he presumed, most other planets humans had colonized. She stooped, grabbed a handful of grass and tugged it. Nothing came up. Hey, said one of the guards. Cut that out. She scowled at him. It's fake, all of it. The meadow grass, flowers, everything. Nothing's real. The children couldn't make elixir because they couldn't find any wood. He recalled how the guards had torn their bags from them and tossed them away on the Bathsheba. Their other belongings had been taken from them too, including elixir ingredients. What are you gonna do? The guard who had spoken before demanded. Make your minds up, or we'll take you back. That one, said Fern, pointing at the central largest play centre. I want to go on that one. It was also the busiest centre. 30 or 40 children were playing on it, running up and tumbling down the 2 hillocks, lining up to take a turn on the zip line that ran between them, throwing plastic chippings at each other in the play pit, and playing on the other equipment, screaming and yelling. Would you push me? Darius asked Bryce. The swing was a wide dish of netting, currently empty. Sure. Darius climbed onto the dish and lay down, spread-eagled. Hold on tight. Bryce gave the dish a hard push and stepped back. The dish swung high, and Darius giggled wildly. It was a bittersweet moment. In another life, another place, accompanying Carina's siblings to the park would have been an ordinary event. Over the time he'd spent with them, he'd grown to love them like family. Yet here they all were, trapped in this God-forsaken place, held against their will by people whose designs were as yet opaque. Parthenia chatted with one of the guards as the children played. It was the one who looked at her too long, and in a way that made Bryce's ire rise. In an earlier whispered conversation, she had told him this guard had made a habit of walking into her room without knocking and hovering over her whenever he was on duty. Bryce gave the swing another hard push. I want to practice climbing, Fern announced loudly. You're not allowed, a guard barked. Yet Fern marched determinedly toward the wall. Hey, come back here, shouted the guard, going after him. Fern ran. At the same time, Oriana pushed another girl down a slope, making her scream with alarm. The The girl's parents rushed over, got in Oriana's face and yelled at her. A guard stepped forward to intervene. Bryce gave the swing the hardest push yet. As it reached its zenith, Darius launched himself off it. As he landed, he collapsed dramatically and began hollering as if in agony. "I broke my leg! I think I broke my leg!" As the third guard sped toward them, the one Parthenia was speaking to moved away from her, but she grabbed his jacket and rose onto her tiptoes to kiss him. While the guard checking on Darius knelt down beside him, Bryce slipped away. He dipped into a tunnel running under a hillock and crawled to the opposite end. Looking out, he spotted a father focused on the altercation going on between a guard and the parents Oriana had offended. "Hey," he called out. The man turned toward him. "My kid's hurt herself in here. Can you help me get her out?" The man hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his own child unwatched. "Please." He bent down to look inside the tunnel. He squinted, trying to see the imaginary child in the darkness. Bryce seized him and hauled him all the way inside. "Sorry." He punched the man's jaw. The father was dazed but not out. "Sorry," he repeated as he knocked his victim's head against the concrete tunnel wall. That did the trick. Bryce ripped off his prison uniform and in an agony of fumbling and breathless tension, removed the man's clothes and put them on. Now he could blend in with the locals. The alarm had already been raised. The guards were shouting, telling the parents to look for an escaped prisoner. Bryce emerged from the tunnel, pulled his new garment straight, and walked quickly to the exit. Chapter 24. "Rano's shelter," Carina said into the interface. "I want to speak to Rano's shelter." "You're wasting your time," Pamuk said, twisting her pinky in her ear. She withdrew her finger, inspected the treasure she'd excavated, and flicked it onto the floor. "He isn't gonna answer." The merc was lying on her bed in the room they shared. They'd been roommates for 12 days, which was 12 days too long. "He will eventually. He has to. The allure of my healthy reproductive status will be too seductive for him to resist." Her tone was light and ironic as she slipped into the customary merc banter, but in reality the notion sickened her. Ever since she had discovered the truth behind the Sotlozans' weird behavior, she had struggled to wrap her head around what they were doing. Kidnapping innocent spacefarers, using their non-irradiated status to provide fresh, healthy gametes and inject new life into the gene pool, and all just so Sotlozans could prolong their screwed-up existence on their poisonous planet. Naturally, she'd told all the black dogs everything she'd learned from Hedron Mafmi. If their rooms were bugged and the security forces heard her, she didn't care. There was nothing to be lost by pretending they didn't know their captor's dirty little secret. The mercs' movements were already restricted, and they had something the Sotlozans desperately wanted, the ability to bear healthy children. So what could they seriously do to hurt them? The small comfort the nauseating revelation had given her was that her siblings and Ava's baby were probably receiving good treatment, wherever they were. She had been worrying about them ever since the taking of the Bathsheba, but she still didn't know what had happened to Bryce. "Rano's shelter," she repeated. The screen remained silent and blank. She flopped onto her bed. "You giving up?" Pamuk asked. "No." Silence. "Okay," said Pamuk. "I'm gonna get something to eat. You coming?" The merc walked to the door, but then she turned and said, "You know, maybe we should stop fighting the inevitable." "What do you mean?" "Maybe Jackson was wrong. Playing the long game doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere. It might have been better to go out in a blaze of glory fighting the bastards. Better than defeat and a slow death on a dead-end world." Is that how you really feel? I'm just saying, for the first time ever, I'm starting to think there might not be a way out. Coming from someone like Pamuk, this wasn't idle speculation. Carina sat up. Are you guys planning on doing something dumb? The merc looked evasive. Nah. Yes, you are. It would be typical of the black dogs if, faced with being trapped in domestic tedium forever, they would rather seek a quick end, taking as many hostiles with them as they could. Don't do it, Carina said. Whatever it is, don't do it. There's still hope we can get out of here. I never said we were going to do anything, but you have to admit we're truly screwed. You can't get what you need for you-know-what, and neither can your sibs. We have no way of getting back to the ship, and even if we did, we would never leave the system without their giant vacuum cleaner pulling us right back in again. When we first got here, I thought we had a sweet deal. Spend a little time with the weirdos who want to wine and dine us, while we figured out how to get them to leave us alone. Then flash bang and we're back on the Bathsheba, grabbing some decades-long shut-eye on the way to Earth. The bulky merc sighed before continuing. But here we are, weeks later, one good man down, and no farther on with getting away from this place. I don't have the patience for this shit, and I'm sure as hell not going to be some guy's broodmare. So, while I'm not saying anyone's planning on doing anything rash and bloody, if something like that were to happen, could you blame us? Yeah, I could. Absolutely. We've hardly been here 5 minutes. There are lots of things to try yet. Like what? Like I'm not going to tell you, am I? Someone could be listening in. Pamuk narrowed her eyes. I'm gonna get something to eat. As she left, Carina lay down again. Shit. If she didn't come up with something soon, the black dogs would take matters into their own hands. And then who knew what might happen, except that it would be violent and perilous for everyone involved. Though she had to agree that things looked bad, she was far from giving up. She had her family to think about, and Bryce. She would fight to her dying breath to at least see them again. But the black dogs were not like her. They lived in order to live, and the life the Sot Lozans proposed was no life to them at all. Maybe she should have killed Hedron Mafmi out in the deadlands between towns. She would have been the primary suspect, and so perhaps in great danger. But it would have made the Sot Lozans realize who they were dealing with. Perhaps they would have understood it was safer to allow this latest set of victims to go on their way. Maybe I should have killed Hedron just for the pleasure of it. Pain shot up from her palms. She realized she was gripping her hands into fists so tightly her fingernails were biting into her flesh. She relaxed her hands. She mustn't lose it. The black dogs might not be able to keep their heads, but she must. She had to. "Carina," said a tired, melancholic voice. It was Rano speaking to her from the interface. She leapt up and ran to the device. "I'm here." The man's face was wan and downcast. "I'm not sure if I should be doing this. Why do you want to speak to me?" I was wondering if you had any more of that horrible liquor you gave me the other night." A sad smile. "There's plenty more. But why do you want it if it tastes so bad?" "I'm a masochist. Didn't I tell you?" "You must have forgotten to mention it." "I did. So what do you say? Want to have another go at getting me drunk and taking advantage of me?" "I wouldn't ever," he replied, shocked. "You're kidding, right?" "What do you think?" I think I'll take a chance." "Great. Will you pick me up?" "Only some idiot made a stupid rule about us not being allowed to leave our hotel without a Sot Lozan accompanying us." "That idiot would be me. I'll be there in 5 minutes." "As I understand it," he said, while she climbed into his vehicle, You know all about my world now, and why you're here. I wouldn't say I know all about your planet. I mean, you must have forgotten some fascinating snippets of local history in the lesson you gave me the other night. But I know the main parts, yeah. And I think I'm also right in saying you're not going to reveal who told you. So he didn't know what had happened in the barren wastes with Hedron. It wasn't so strange. Like the rest of the prisoners, she had come into contact with many Sotlosans. The only person he could know for sure hadn't given the game away was him. Why would I betray someone who did me a big favour? She asked. Why subject another person to punishment? Is that how you see your lives here? As a punishment? Her jaw dropped. Not exactly a punishment, because we didn't do anything wrong. But what do you think this is to us? A ride at a fun fair? You stole our ship. You've trapped us here on your deadly world. Did you think you were helping us out? Does it really matter where you live out the rest of your lives? You were on a colony vessel, planning to settle somewhere. Why not Sotlosa? You have to be joking. His jaw clenched and he looked away from her, out into the darkness. He seemed to be wrestling with something. His conscience? Why don't we talk some more over that nasty drink of yours, she suggested. Let's do that. At his home, he not only had the noxious brew he'd offered her before, but also crispy snacks in a bowl. When he offered her the bowl as they sat down, she took one and ate it without asking its origin. It was better not to know. The snack was quite nice. Now the beans have been mostly spilled. Will you spill the rest of them? If I have to stay here, what can I expect? It's been clear from the start that you guys are trying to partner up with us. We get the idea is so you can become parents. That's right, isn't it? He leaned back and spread an arm over the back of the sofa. There's no point in denying it, so I won't. But I do like you, Carina. I like you as a person, not just because of the opportunity you offer. That's easy to say, but if I wasn't from off-planet, would you even be interested? I admit it's hard to know for sure, but I like to think so. How old are you? 36. How old do you think I am? Mid to late 20s. She shook her head. Try again. I'm about 20. I'm not sure exactly. Things get muddled when you do a lot of travelling in space. His eyebrows popped up. I didn't realise. You look... He faltered to silence. It's okay, you can say it. I know I look older than my age. I've had a hard life, with one thing and another. What do you think about being my partner now? His brow furrowed, but his internal conflict only lasted a brief moment. The age difference doesn't have to be a barrier. You don't only look older than you are, you act older. Your hard life has made you grow up fast. Thanks, but... She'd been about to tell him he'd just proven to her that his desire to be a father superseded everything. All notions of decorum, integrity and morality. But insulting him wasn't going to get her anywhere. What? Never mind. She took a sip of liquor. Can you clear up some questions I have about life here? I can try. As I understand it, everyone dies from tumours while still relatively young. How does that work out? I haven't seen anyone who seemed to be sick or lots of hospitals. How can your society function if it has to care for huge numbers of people suffering slow, lingering deaths? He grimaced. It's rarely slow and lingering. Most Sotlosans choose to take the quick way out when their illness begins to interfere with their everyday lives. Everyone knows a tale of someone who didn't self-euthanize, and it isn't a pretty one. There are retirement clinics all over the place. You just haven't spotted them because you don't know what you're looking at. Still, I would have thought it would be hard to know when it's time to go. It must take years from diagnosis until... You don't get it. We've been living and dying like this for centuries. The progress of the disease is well known, and it's the same in virtually all of us. From the appearance of the first tumour, we have about 6 months, tops." "That fast?" He took in a breath and let it out slowly. "There's a drug we take that suppresses the effects of radiation. It's in all the food in trace amounts. If you eat a normal diet, you get enough of it for your body weight. Once the drug stops being effective, the disease takes over quickly. Coming from off-planet, you and your companions will live much longer than me. You have a head start, and the drug is working in you now, fortifying you." "That's a relief to hear. Another thing, is it only the managerial class who can reproduce? I don't understand how you maintain your population." "Only higher-ranking Sotlosans can pick a partner and have children directly with him or her. Once the match has been made, you would be expected to also donate your eggs for sale to the general public." Carina coughed up the drink she'd been swallowing, spraying it over her front. Donate her eggs? If the need to escape hadn't already been great, it had suddenly become imperative. Any child of hers conceived with a Sotlosan had a 50% chance of being a mage. And not only her children, but Parthenia's and the rest of her siblings once they matured. Rano had thrown another ingredient into the disastrous mix. He was patting her back. "Are you okay? Would you like some water? That drink is pretty strong." "I'm fine," she croaked. "It just went down the wrong way." When she'd recovered, she said, "I appreciate your honesty. I have to confess, when we first met, I thought you were a bit of an asshole. But now I can see there's more to you than meets the eye." He smiled. "I'm glad I'm making a better impression." She reached out and squeezed his hand. His smile widened. Vigo had been right. You really did catch more cultries with Ninery than Jadronic. Chapter 25. The goods in the store were unfamiliar. When food had arrived at the prison cell or at the home where the Sotlosans were keeping Carina's family and Ava, it had been prepared. They were strange meals, to be sure, but cooked and presented on bowls and plates in the usual fashion. Here the packages, boxes and packets displayed pictures Bryce didn't recognize, and the names were in the Sotlosan's native language. One piece of information he was able to glean from looking at the diagrams and numbers was that nearly everything needed to be cooked, or at least prepared in some way. To do that would require access to a kitchen, and the only place he had access to was the street. A shopper approached down the aisle, and he silently cursed. He'd deliberately come here in the early hours of the morning to avoid other people. He waited for her to pass, but when she reached him she stopped. He put the product he was looking at back on the shelf and moved away, but not before she let out an ugh of disgust and lifted the back of her hand to her nose. Yes, he smelled. It had been 3 days since he'd escaped. He'd been sleeping rough, and the only water he had access to was in public restrooms, where washing his face, neck and pits was the best he could do. Even that was risky. The authorities must have put out the alert that a prisoner had escaped, and anyone washing themselves in a restroom basin would look suspicious. More worrying than his odour, however, was the growing ache in his belly. He was faint with hunger, and being weak and unable to think straight wasn't going to help anyone get off this planet. He had to eat. Dining at a restaurant or cafe was out of the question. He had no qualms about running off without paying for his meal, but again, he couldn't afford the danger of being seized or attracting attention. He picked up another packet. It showed a child eating green gloop with a manic smile on his face, as if the gloop were the tastiest thing ever. That was a similarity between all the food items. They all portrayed children or babies, and the youngsters were all ecstatic to be consuming the product. Apparently no adult Sot Lozans ever ate. Their culture seemed obsessed with youth. It explained Darius's observation that the guards felt warm and fuzzy around Ava's baby, and why their treatment of the kids was kinder than that of the rest of the prisoners. He put the packet back and moved on. There had to be something he could eat. It was the first grocery store he'd found that had a manual checkout. The others had been run in the usual style of automatically registering the customer's credit as they entered and subtracting the costs of their purchases when they left. Here you had to scan the codes on the packets and your cred chip, or not. The woman who had been disgusted by his smell left the aisle. He checked in the other direction. The area was empty. He picked up 3 packets of green gloop and slipped them inside his shirt. Swiftly he headed for the front of the shop. The scene beyond the doors was dark, the road deserted. The doors pulled apart at his approach. He stepped into the widening gap. An alarm blared out. The door snapped closed, catching his leg. He gave a gasp, twisted and wrenched it free. He was out. He ran, favouring his unhurt leg. Next to the store was an alleyway. He raced down it. At the end he turned right, darted across the street and then sped down a second alley. And so on, until he'd been running for 20 minutes and he was out of breath. He'd put around a kilometre between himself and the scene of the crime before he stopped. Would the Sot Lozan authorities study recordings of the shoplifter? He had no idea if petty crime was common or rare here. Regardless, he'd had to take the chance his stealing would reveal his rough location. He had to eat. In the nook between a wall and a fence, he sat on the ground. One thing to be said for Sot Lozan was that the temperature was always mild and it never rained. He took out the 3 packets from his shirt and placed 2 of them beside him. He had to feel rather than see how to open the third, tearing apart the box in the darkness. 4 thick sachets were wedged inside. He pulled one out and used his teeth to rip a corner open. Something wet oozed out. He sucked at the hole. The paste that hit his tongue was salty and gritty, though it was almost flavourless. There was something about the texture that made his stomach rebel as he swallowed, forcing the substance back up into his throat. He grimaced and swallowed again. Then he squeezed more from the sachet into his mouth. Adjusting his position, his hand brushed the 2 packets on the ground. Could he manage to eat all 3 tonight? The thought of it made him retch, but he would have to try. He had an important job to do. The following morning brought an aching stomach, cramped back and sore head. He sat up. He'd gone to sleep resting his head on his arm, but at some point in the remainder of the night it had slipped onto the hard ground. After 3 nights in the open with little to eat and no shelter, exhaustion was creeping up on him. The time he had to act effectively was running out. The problem was he had no map of the town. When Nala had explained in whispers how to get from the park to the place, her instructions had been complicated. Though he'd thought he'd committed them to memory, when it came down to actually making the journey, he'd become lost. It was only now, after days of searching, that he knew exactly where he was and how to get to where he needed to be. The familiar lilac sky occupied the gap between the walls, and pedestrians passed by along the road at the alley's exit. He'd slept late after his long night, thankfully unnoticed in the shadowy corner. After twisting his torso from side to side to ease the knots in his back muscles, he got to his feet, catching sight of the empty packets from last night's meal. His stomach lurched and he sweated as he fought down nausea. His mouth felt like a sandpit. He smoothed down his wrinkled, dirty clothes and walked to the alley's end. When the road was fairly empty, he stepped out nonchalantly, as if on a shopping expedition or on his way to work. His first stop was a public restroom he'd made a mental note of yesterday. As well as being thirsty, he needed to smarten up if he was to avoid attracting attention. The restroom was empty. He bent down and took a long drink from the faucet before splashing water on his face. As he stood up, he saw his reflection in the mirror. What a sight! His eyes stared out from dark hollows. His skin was cadaverous, and he'd grown a bedraggled beard. He hadn't looked so bad since the time he'd been slowly dying of Ithian plague. He wet his hands and dragged them through his hair, flattening it. There wasn't a lot else he could do to improve his appearance. Outside, the street was growing busier. Lunchtime had to be approaching. The timing was fortunate. It was easier to remain anonymous in a crowd. The museum was only 10 minutes' walk away. When he arrived, a short line had formed at the entrance. He joined the end. He had no idea how he would get inside without money to buy a ticket. Maybe he could sneak in. He reached the ticket machine and realized his plan was hopeless. A barrier and turnstile stood between him and the museum's interior. He couldn't walk past the machine and jump the barrier without being seen. Then, no doubt, an official would soon be along to throw him out. Someone behind him spoke. He turned. The speaker was a young woman, and she looked mildly annoyed. She had spoken in the local language, and he hadn't understood a word, but he guessed she had told him to hurry up. He made the universal open-handed gesture that meant he had no money. It was a desperate measure, but then his situation was desperate. She frowned at him as if he was stupid, reached past him and pressed some keys. Then she gestured for him to go through the turnstile. No money was required. The visitors were only inputting information. What information, he had no idea. Elation washing over him, he pushed through the barrier. Now all he had to do was find the object Nala had discovered in her long searches of the Sotlozan net, and steal it. The latter was definitely going to be the harder task. Chapter 26. Growing up in a small town on Ithia, Bryce hadn't visited many museums, but he got the general idea. They usually had a theme, like science, technology, the natural world, or a period of history. This one was devoted to Sotloza's colonization. From the fateful accident to winning against all odds, Nala had translated from the website. Her conversation with him had taken place directly in front of the guards, none of them understanding its significance.
"Look what I found, Uncle Bryce. There's a museum all about Sotloza, and it's right here in this town."
"Is there?" He'd sat down beside her to take a look at the screen.
"Uh-huh. It's so interesting."
"Museums are boring," Oriana said. "Unless they're about textiles," Fern added.
"This one isn't boring,"
Nala protested.
"It has objects that are hundreds of years old."
She scrolled through the pictures, showing relics from the colony ship, a replica of one of the first dwellings, the text of a colonist's diary, an early example of locally made clothing, and the stages of developments in food production. There were also titles to special exhibits. "That's cool," said Bryce. "Can you read what those words say?"
"This one,"
she pointed,
"says sounds of the new planet, and the next one is going underground."
"Maybe you can go there one day, if the guards allow it." She surveyed the two men keeping watch over them.
Maybe, but they don't usually let us go where there are lots of people crowded together. They say it's too easy for us to get separated and lost.
Neither of the guards commented, but they didn't deny what she was saying either. Of course, by get separated and lost, they meant slip away and escape. Angling the interface subtly away from their scrutiny, Nala said in a quieter tone,
"There's something really cool I want to show you."
She brushed the screen with her fingertips, bringing up an image of a box on a pair of odd legs. "What's that?"
"Don't you know?"
She chuckled as if he were a little stupid.
"We had one at our estate. Mother used it for all of us. It's for babies."
Darius peered over the edge of the screen.
"What is it?" "Oh, a cradle."
"Yes," he went on authoritatively.
"When the baby cries, you put it in, and then you push the cradle to make it rock. That's what these are for."
He pointed at the legs.
"That's why they're curved. Babies like rocking. Ava rocks hers all the time,"
Nala explained.
"It's because it reminds them of being inside their mothers when they were walking about." "Oh yes," said Darius. "That makes sense."
Bryce was silent. The reason Nala was showing him the cradle had just hit him. It was made of wood.
"Do you like it?"
Nala asked pointedly. Yeah, looks great." A cradle. Where was the cradle among all these exhibits? The place was dimly lit and filled with shuffling visitors, slowly making their way past the displays. He followed in their wake. Unable to read the signs, he had no idea where the cradle might be. He would just have to search everywhere until he found it. He passed artifact after artifact, tech items from the home planet, artworks, ancient medical equipment, an original deep sleep cell from the colony ship, reports from the first media station, so many things. The visitors seemed deeply impressed by the exhibits, as if they were extremely valuable, though they were only old and mundane. He saw no cradle. He grew tired. The gnawing hunger that had forced him to steal yesterday had returned, and last night's slumber had not been restful. Sleeping outside on hard asphalt, the prospect of discovery constantly at the back of his mind, he'd barely snoozed. Pins seemed to be stabbing at his eyes, and he stifled a yawn. A doorway opened into darkness, lit by moving light. Recorded audio leaked out. A vid or holo was playing in the side room. He stepped inside, grateful for the opportunity to sit down. The show was ending, and the audience was filing out. He took a seat at the back and rested on the wall. More attendees dribbled in. The few that came close to him altered course, his unwashed odour perhaps deterring them. The screen faded to black, replaced by figures counting down to the next showing. His eyelids grew heavy, and he began to drift off. A blast of sound signalled the beginning of the vid, jerking him awake. More visitors had arrived during his brief nap. A starship floated in space. He recognised it instantly. It was the ship that had dragged the Bathsheba the final part of her unwilling voyage to the planet. So the locals had converted their original colony vessel to a hauler. The camera zoomed in, and the ship's hull melted away, revealing an operating engine. The image was not realistic as far as he understood, only a representation. Lights moved through channels inside the machine, which was not the way space-going engines generated power. A second burst of sound, this time accompanied by a flash of light. The scene cut to an asteroid speeding through the void on a collision course with the ship. Another cut, and the view was inside the colony vessel once more, only it showed the crew running about in a crazed panic. Bryce smiled. In his experience, starship crews didn't react like that when faced with disaster. There was a lot more standing around open-mouthed and staring, while a few people made stupid suggestions about what they should do. The asteroid hit, tearing a rent meters wide in the hull. Fuel sprayed spectacularly into space. The audience gave a collective sigh of awe. So this was the fateful accident? After the inevitably melodramatic reactions from the crew, the story grew more boring. The vessel was clearly off course, a fact unknown to the apparently hundreds of thousands of colonists in deep sleep, if the scene involving the vast rows and columns of cells was historically accurate. Meanwhile, the crew ran through a series of attempts to return to the original heading. Bryce's eyelids began to close again. Warm and comfortable, his hunger pangs abating, and the danger of imminent recapture far away, he fell deeply asleep. He jolted awake so violently the people in front of him turned and stared. How long had he slept? Through at least one entire showing of the vid. It was showing the asteroid strike again, and the place was packed. The chairs each side of him were occupied, despite his unpleasant scent. He should get up and look for the cradle, but he didn't want to attract additional attention by forcing his way out. He decided to stay to the end. The crew repeated their ineffective attempts to recover from the disaster that had befallen the ship. Then the vid moved to a new phase in the planet's history. The colonists began to settle the planet. The vid showed several hundred awakened from deep sleep, presumably those with the necessary skills to begin construction of the settlements. But conditions on the surface were atrocious. It was exactly as Rees had said, a nightmare of howling winds and scouring dust. But something else was also wrong. The settlers were falling ill. The audience, which had been shuffling, murmuring, coughing and rustling snack packets as they surreptitiously ate, became still and silent. It was a grisly scene. The earliest colonists took to their beds or collapsed as they worked, sores erupting on their skin, teeth and hair falling out, eyeballs bleeding. The vid displayed an expanse of gravestones, buffeted by swirling dust clouds. Bryce wrinkled his nose. So the surface harboured diseases too? It was no wonder the colonists had delved underground. More and more of them died. The graveyard stretched wider. Then the accompanying music changed from slow, sad tones to upbeat, soaring rhythms. Work hollowing out the underground sped up. New buildings were constructed, roads and hospitals to treat the people exposed to the disease above ground. Time seemed to march forward at a rapid pace. The colony ship appeared again, this time emitting an attraction beam that held another vessel at its farther end. When the two ships reached the planet, a shuttle flew from the newcomer to the surface, now miraculously calmer. After landing, the ramp descended and smiling, waving figures walked down it. Sot Lozans greeted them joyously, shaking hands and slapping backs. What a propaganda piece it was. Did the general public really know what happened to the people their authorities seized from space? The show was over, and the audience was leaving. Bryce got to his feet and filed out with the rest, even more determined to find the wood the kids needed to make their elixir. He guessed Carina must be facing the same problem. All they needed was a little of the precious natural material. There it is! Directly opposite him as he exited the viewing room stood the cradle. It was smaller than he'd imagined. Maybe that, along with his fatigue, was why he hadn't noticed it before. Its soft lustre and grain, and the wearing on the side from the touching of many mothers' hands, told him it was authentic. It must have come all the way from the origin planet, perhaps a precious family heirloom. The museum remained full of people. It would be a while before it closed. He had plenty of time to find somewhere to hide. Chapter 27. "I hope it isn't too soon to say I told you so," said Rano. "That depends on what you're talking about," Carina replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. They were driving to Una, the main city of the zone and the first settlement on Sotloza. Carina had expressed a desire to get to know more about the planet, and Rano had jumped at the opportunity. From his comment it was clear he had the impression she was coming around to the idea of remaining here. "Isn't it obvious?" he asked. "Look at us. I'm showing you the sights. We're getting along pretty well. This is very different from the newcomers' banquet, wouldn't you say?" "You mean that night when my friends kicked off? I didn't even know it was called that. All we could figure out was that we wouldn't eat unless we boarded the transport that took us there." He winced. "It might have been better to give you all more of an explanation. I'll bear that in mind in future." So the Sotlozans were planning on bringing more victims to their planet? Carina felt sick. If she managed to help everyone from the Bathsheba to escape, she wanted to do it in a way that would make their captors think twice about pulling the same stunt again. "You know," said Rano, "I don't think I ever told you my ancestors were outsiders." "I don't think you did. Where were they from originally?" "I don't know. It was one of my great-grandparents." "How often do you pull people in from space?" "Roughly once per generation. The geneticists calculated that was how often we needed the injection of undamaged genes to maintain the planet's population and health. We try to do it as rarely as we can." "Every 30 or 40 years?" "About that. So you can see how special you are to us, and why we might come across as heavy-handed. I won't have another opportunity to be with someone like you." She seemed to recall Chertang saying that ships disappeared less frequently, so the Sotlozans were taking them from other galactic routes too. "Carina?" "What?" He was looking at her as if he'd expected a different reaction to his weak attempt at an apology. She forced a smile and patted his hand. "I forgive you. Now I know the whole story, I can see why you're desperate for new blood. If you didn't do what you do, you would die out." He nodded. "We nearly did. Hundreds of thousands died in the 1st century. That's another reason we need new genes added to the pool. The bottleneck reduced our genetic diversity considerably. When you think about it, our survival has been a miracle." "It certainly has." Carina tried to sound genuinely enthusiastic. Inside, she was wondering what else the Sotlozans might consider doing to ensure their colony's success. Torture? Genocide? Was nothing off limits? "You aren't convinced." She sighed. She was a terrible actor. "As a victim of your people's methods, it's hard for me to wrap my head around your reasoning." "It is too soon for me to say I told you so. Give it time. I'm sure you'll change your mind. As you said, you're the victim here, so it isn't going to be easy for you to see my side of things. But plenty of societies have been forced to commit unsavory acts in order to survive. We aren't any different." The road from Sarnak to Una was lined with buildings. It was clear that Sarnak was a satellite town, probably originally a mining site. As the colony became established, the town had developed, and businesses and homes had been built along the adjoining route. Una was something new. 3- and 4-story buildings had appeared in the distance. Carina leaned toward the car's window and looked up. The sky was higher. The clouds weirdly elongated as they moved across the slope. "The ceiling engineers never ironed out the kinks in that effect. Everyone is used to it now." The chamber is taller here, closer to the surface.
For the first underground settlement, the colonists tried to build something that mimicked where they'd come from. It took a while for them to figure out that wasn't optimal for protecting against radiation. So the level is slightly higher here. It's better in places like Sarnak and Laft and the other zones, which were dug later, but it's still within safe parameters. Plenty of people live in Una, and their life expectancy is about the same as the rest of the planet.
Thanks, that's reassuring. She was unable to extract the note of sarcasm from her voice. Rano gave her a sidelong look. You catch more cultries with Ninery than Jadronic. Where are you taking me?
The tallest place in town. There's a restaurant with a great view of the city.
She grimaced.
Is something wrong? I thought it would be nice to eat and chat. I want to get to know you better. All we've talked about so far is Sotloza and a little bit about me.
Nothing's wrong. Perhaps a great view of the city would be useful. Sounds good. He'd reserved a table next to a window. As he read out the menu and explained what each dish was, Carina looked out over the expanse of buildings and streets. She spotted several factories. You pick for me, she interrupted. What's that place over there? He followed the line of her pointing finger.
Textiles plant. It supplies all of Sotloza, just about.
What about that? She pointed at another set of buildings.
A bacterial food factory. Are you looking for something in particular? What's your specialty?
He went on more seriously.
Not that you would need to get a job. I make more than enough to support us both, plus any little ones that come along.
She suppressed a shudder. There was something in what Rano had said that reminded her of Stefan Scherer. The little that she'd softened toward the security chief turned to stone. There were layers to this man. Deep underneath everything, he was psychopathic. He didn't see her as a real person, only a thing that could offer him something he wanted. They were all psychopathic. All the Sotlozans had to know what their authorities did to ensure their survival, and they all went along with it. Perhaps it was a result of the weeding out of the colonists that went on in the early years. Only those who truly didn't give a shit about anyone else had lived long enough to reproduce. Environmental pressures had selected the very worst of them.
I'm rushing ahead again,
said Rano apologetically. Just a bit. I heard there are giant fans circulating the air and removing radioactivity. Where are they?
On the surface, a network of ducts runs through the crust, opening out at intervals in the ceiling. You can't see them. The sky effect disguises them.
But I thought no one could live on the surface. Who runs the fans? He paused before continuing as if reluctantly.
They're mostly automated, but technicians go up there on a rota for service and maintenance.
Isn't that dangerous? She recalled the skinless figure in the mansion she had burgled.
It is, somewhat. Measures are taken to protect the workers.
She waited for him to explain more.
Let's talk about something else.
I'd rather look at the view for a little while. Why don't you put in our order? While Rano selected the dishes, her mind ticked over. She doubted she would ever be able to create elixir, and it appeared her siblings were facing the same problem. She had to think of another way to escape Sotloza, and fast, before the black dogs gave up hope. Chapter 28. Bryce's greatest fear was motion sensors. If they were part of the museum's security system, as soon as he stepped from his hiding place he would set them off. Then he would have minutes, or even only seconds, to grab the cradle and get out, somehow. He hadn't figured that part out yet. In fact, he hadn't figured hardly anything out. All he knew was that he had to get that wooden item to the kids at all costs. even if he ended up dead. If he didn't manage it, they would never do it by themselves. The guards would be keeping a tighter rein on them than ever. They probably wouldn't be allowed out on any more excursions. He only hoped they weren't being punished for helping him. He peeked out. Beyond the replica hut from the early days of colonization, all was still and silent. He hadn't heard movement or voices for at least a couple of hours. The place had closed ages ago. The cleaning bots had done their work, thankfully identifying him not in need of sanitation. Perhaps their sensors had told him he was organic. Since then, the place had been silent. Tiny floor lights lit the walkways. Fortunately, otherwise he would have been forced to blunder around in the dark. He peeked out again. Motion sensors? Not a thing moved. How much longer should he wait? Another few hours. After stealing the cradle, he would have to get it to the kids. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily hide, and their house was a couple of kilometers away. Carrying a priceless artifact through the streets would have to wait until the early hours when no one was about. He adjusted his position to ease his cramped muscles and tried to forget that he was famished before settling down to wait. Footsteps. He tensed, listening. The steps were purposeful, heavy, and accompanied by faint creaks. It sounded like a man, fairly heavy and approaching. Bryce leaned out a fraction, so half his head and one eye moved into the hut's open doorway. This section of the exhibit was in darkness, so he wasn't concerned he would be seen. Coming down the walkway was a figure turned almost entirely black by the minimal lighting. The floor lights gilded the buttons of his uniform and made the moustached face spectral with shadows. The lights glinted from something else, the handgun at his hip. In one sense, the appearance of the museum guard was a relief. If someone was patrolling the place, it meant there were no motion sensors. In another sense, it was an added worry. How could he get away with his prize without attracting the armed man's attention? The outer door had to be locked. He'd been planning to bust his way out, but the guard would put a pulse round in his back before he'd made it 10 meters. Okay. He had plenty of time to come up with a foolproof plan. Hours later, he had nothing. No plausible explanation for being here if discovered and challenged. No smart trick to disarm the guard. No masterful scheme to get through the locked outer door. That wasn't quite right. He now knew the guard performed his walkabout roughly every half hour. He had counted out the seconds and minutes 3 times in a row to make sure. What he didn't know was where the man went after he'd passed by. Did he return to an office a minute away, or did he complete a full circuit of the museum? A circuit would make sense, which meant that if Bryce waited 15 minutes after the guard passed by before making his move, he would get a good head start. The guard was coming. He sauntered past, the same as he had the last 11 times. The man was regular. He had to give him that. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. 15 minutes later, Bryce slipped quietly out from his hiding place. Slowly and cautiously, he rose to his full height and scanned around. The artifacts took on a new appearance in the quiet darkness. Surrounded by babbling visitors, they'd looked smaller, as well as boring and drab. They seemed to have grown larger and more ancient. They were performing their intended purpose in this place, creating echoes of the lives of the people who had made them and used them, but were now long dead. Chilled not only by the cooled atmosphere, he stepped quickly over to the cradle. Heart racing, he stooped to pick it up, but then snatched his hands away just in time. He was so nervous he'd forgotten to check if it was attached to an alarm. A careful visual inspection told him it didn't appear so. He reached out again, heart in his mouth, and lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy for such a small object. He had the wood. All he needed to do was to get it to the kids. There was still no sign of the guard. He walked softly toward the exit. Prickles ran down his spine as he imagined the guard stepping out in front of him or yelling at him to stop or he would fire. He saw himself stumble and fall, his back destroyed and smoking from a pulse round. He had made it to the turnstile. It was locked, of course. No problem. He leaned over it, lowered the cradle to the floor, and then jumped the barrier. The road beyond the glass wall and doors was empty, lit palely by street lamps. The doors were locked too. He checked the lobby walls for a release mechanism, but found nothing. There was nothing on the doors themselves. They had to be locked remotely, and so they could only be opened the same way. Only 2 or 3 minutes had passed since the guard had made his recent round of the museum. Would it be better to attempt to break out or go back and try to find another exit? Perhaps there was an emergency door that opened from the inside in case of fire. But that would mean risking meeting up with the guard. Bryce hesitated, indecision gnawing at him. Something sounded softly behind him. Footsteps? He hefted the cradle to shoulder level and flung it at the window. With a boing, it bounced back and hit him, smacking into his forehead. At the same time, a siren blared. He found himself on his knees, dazed, the cradle rocking on the floor, blood running into his eye. Fuck, fuck, fuck! His head pounding a protest, he grabbed the cradle. Its impact with the window had shaken its joints loose, and it shifted as he grasped it close. He leapt up. He had to find another way out. He threw the cradle over the barrier, loosening it some more, and then joined it. Without breaking his stride, he snatched it up and darted back into the display area. There was the guard, heading straight for him.
"Stop, or I'll shoot!"
Everything was playing out as he'd feared. He kept on running, heading directly for the guard.
"I said stop, or I'll—"
Bryce lifted the cradle in front of him as a shield. It was wood. If a round hit it, it would scorch and burn, maybe even catch fire. But the energy wouldn't pass through it to his hands. For some reason the guard didn't fire. Was he reluctant to damage the ancient artifact? He continued to shout warnings until, at the last minute, he tried to step out of Bryce's way. He had left it too late. The cradle hit him full force in the face, and Bryce knew how bad that felt. It knocked the guard out cold. Yes! Now all he had to do was to get out, and quickly. The alarm would have alerted more people than just the guard. He raced toward the back of the museum, through a plain door with a sign, and down some stairs. He came to another door, unmarked. Was it the back exit? He tried it and cursed when it didn't open. He put the cradle down and kicked the door, punched it and kicked it some more. He'd got so far, only a single stupid door between him and... He raced back up the stairs, 2 at a time, through the door and back to the guard. The man was coming around.
"Hey," he mumbled, "you."
Bryce had his gun.
"You, that's fine,"
said the guard, lifting his hands.
"You take it."
Bryce sped back to the cradle and aimed the gun at the door's lock. He held down the trigger until the lock was a mess of seared, smoking, melting metal. Then he gave the door a mighty kick. It burst open. Warm night air flooded in, and he was looking into a narrow lane. As he seized the cradle, it broke apart. The rocker's base and sides clattered to the floor. He was holding 2 spindles, 1 in each hand. It didn't matter. All the kids needed was a single piece of wood. It was good that the cradle had broken. Now he had less to carry. He tucked a spindle into his shirt and stepped into the lane. Vehicles with flashing lights stood at each end, blocking it. Chapter 29. The interface on Carina's hotel room wall bleeped. Though it remained blank, Rano's voice said,
"Carina, can I speak to you?"
Said Pamuk, turning over in bed. "What's the time?" The black dogs had been awarded a delivery of Sotlozan liquor, perhaps as a gesture of goodwill, while Carina had been visiting Una with the chief of security. They'd drunk it all at once and smashed the place up. Pamuk had been sleeping off the after effects. Carina told her to go back to sleep and padded over to the screen. "You can turn on the visual. There's nothing here you shouldn't see." His face appeared. "Are you planning another trip for us?" The last one had been enlightening.
"This is a professional call, sorry, though I enjoyed yesterday a lot."
"Me too," she replied, clenching her jaw. "Is there something I can help you with?"
"There is.
His expression turned pained.
I was in two minds about asking you this. Would you accompany me to Grantha?"
"Sure, but I don't know what it is."
"My mistake. Grantha is one of the other zones."
Her heart leapt. She struggled to keep her features neutral. "I'm fine with that. It'll be interesting to see another part of Sotloza."
"Good. I'll be there soon."
"Rano?"
"Yes?"
"You haven't told me why you want me to do this."
They've been having problems with a member of your ship's personnel. I thought, as you do a good job of keeping your group calm and reasonable, aside from that little incident at the Varvara estate, it might help if you talked to him."
She'd become her group's de facto leader, probably due to her image of being the non-violent one. If only Rano knew. She glanced at Pamuk, on her back and snoring, a line of drool running from her mouth, one eye blackened, and a cut on her forehead crusty with dried blood. At some point in the previous night's party she must have gotten into a fight. Calm and reasonable. He obviously didn't know about last night's events yet, or perhaps it was all just another excuse to spend time with her. "See you soon." The only way to reach the other zone was via an underground rail line. They drove to the station and boarded the train's front carriage, reserved for high-ranking officials. Only 2 other passengers occupied the space, a couple in expensive clothes who seemed to recognize the security chief, for they nodded at him deferentially. Carina spotted a lump in the man's throat. Before he could notice her staring, she averted her gaze. They took seats in the opposite corner. "Does that man have a tumor?" she asked quietly as the train set off.
"They're probably taking a final tour of the zones before he goes to a euthanasia centre. A lot of people do it."
The train quickly accelerated. Lights flashed past. "Do you know the name of this person we're going to see?" She had been telling herself it had to be one of the black dogs. Of everyone from the Bathsheba, they would be the least able to tolerate their captivity. Yet she also feared it might be one of the kids. Fern and Nala could be very strong-willed.
"I don't, sorry. Only that it's a male."
The journey took hours. They alighted at the first station in Grantha, and Rano took her into an elevator.
"We're going to a medical centre."
"The man's hurt." He winced.
"I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you, but I've been putting it off. Grantha treats outsiders differently from Una. We prefer a gentler approach, encouraging rather than forcing you to join our society. It usually works, given time. Grantha is more heavy-handed."
"You didn't tell me that. Why didn't you tell me? I assumed everyone's experience was the same. Are the children in this zone?"
"Don't worry. The heavy-handed approach doesn't extend to minors. The children are perfectly safe and unharmed."
"How can I believe you when you've already lied to me?" She hesitated to ask to see them. No one seeing Parthenia and her side by side would fail to notice they were sisters.
I haven't lied to you, Carina, not once.
Not telling me something I should know is also a lie, just a different kind.
There's no need for you to get upset.
I'll decide that. The elevator stopped and the doors opened. In strained silence, she accompanied Rano to a nurse's station where he introduced himself and asked where the patient was. Dread dogged Carina's footsteps as they walked toward the room. She had guessed she was going to see a merc, but perhaps she wasn't. Seeing a black dog in a bad way wouldn't be pleasant, but there was a worse possibility. Rano halted.
This outsider escaped and spent several days on the run. He was hurt during his recapture, so he was brought here for treatment. That was when the Gwantha authorities reached out to me, asking for my advice, and I offered to bring you over to speak to him. Outsiders are valuable to us for all the reasons you now know. At the end of the day, we don't want them hurt any more than they want to be hurt. It would be in everyone's interests if you could persuade your shipmate to be more accepting of his situation.
Escaped? What do you mean? Are my friends being held prisoner?
Your own movements are restricted. You know that.
She frowned. You're lying to me again. I want to see this man. She stepped up to the door, but it remained shut.
You don't have the clearance to enter.
Open it.
Perhaps you should calm down.
Open it! Sighing, he placed his hand on the wall panel and the door slid open. Carina didn't recognize him at first. He was in such a bad way. Swathed in dressings, connected by wires and tubes to two machines, exposed skin swollen and purple. All she could tell was that the figure was male. She stepped closer. The man's eyes were closed, but opened at her approach. Then she recognized him. Bryce! Her legs turned weak, and she dropped to her knees beside the bed.
You know him well,
Rano said, tension edging his tone. What have you done to him? She blurted. What have you done?
Not me, Carina. As I said, the Gwantha authorities.
But she didn't hear any more. It was like Vigo all over again. If she only had elixir, she could heal him. She could take away his suffering and make him healthy. But she couldn't. She was crippled and weak. Bryce, she sobbed, burying her face into the pillow next to his head and taking his hand. A voice inside told her she shouldn't give away her feelings, but she couldn't help it. He was so badly injured, it was clear he could have been killed. They'd nearly murdered him.
It's okay,
he murmured through thick lips.
I'm okay. It's good to see you.
Why had the Sotlozans done this to him? It must have been the same as had happened with Vigo. Somehow they couldn't have known he was an outsider.
I'm beginning to think this wasn't such a good idea,
said Rano tensely.
I confess I didn't know the extent of this man's injuries. They're as much of a surprise to me as to you.
She rose to her feet and whirled to face him. You're all bastards, and you're insane! A bunch of psychopaths trapping innocent people, bringing them to this hellhole, forcing them to... She didn't have words to express how she felt. She returned to Bryce's side. Kneeling down once more, she leaned close and whispered softly in his ear. I'll get you out. If it kills me, I'm going to get you and everyone else out, and I'll leave this planet a smoking ash heap.
We should go.
Rano touched her arm.
I can see this was a mistake.
She slapped him away. Get your slimy Sotlozan hands off me.
That's enough. I've been patient with you, but you don't get to speak to me like that. I'm not just anyone, you know.
What are you going to do? Beat me up? Send in goons to work me over? Are you going to put me in a hospital bed too? Rano was speechless, his cheeks flushed. She got up and bent down to gently kiss Bryce. "Hold on," she muttered. "Just hold on." He blinked a silent acknowledgement. Chapter 30. Clawing her way back into Rano's affections after displaying her feelings for Bryce wasn't going to be easy, but she had to do it. On the train ride back to Una, the security chief was mostly silent. When he did speak, he was stiffly polite. She hoped he was at war with himself after witnessing the brutality inflicted on outsiders in another zone. He'd done a great job convincing himself that the habit of Sotlozans in snatching people from space wasn't so bad. Bryce was evidence to the contrary, evidence that was hard to ignore or explain away. When the train stopped at the station, she said, hating herself, "I'm sorry for losing it at the medical centre. When I saw my friend, I was very shocked. I wasn't expecting that." He seemed to soften a little. "Neither was I. If I'd known he was that bad, I wouldn't have taken you there. Outsiders would never be treated like that here in Una." She was reminded of Calverley, the former Shura officer killed by the Lotokrillans. He'd maintained that the Shura cause was for the greater good overall, and that was why he supported it. Though he'd died nobly in the end, he'd been a liar like Rano, lying to himself as much as to everyone else. "I'm glad to hear it. For what it's worth, I didn't get the impression you could be so savage or merciless." He smiled tightly. "Thank you. That means a lot." As they'd been speaking, they'd exited the station. "I'll arrange an autocar to take you back to your hotel. I have to go straight to work. Lots to do. I'm going to speak to my counterpart in Grantha." "About the outsider?" "I'm not happy about what I saw today." "Will I see you later?"
"Do you want to?"
"I do." His smile relaxed.
"I'll pick you up at the usual time."
When she arrived at the hotel, the Mercs were up and sitting around the lounge they'd just about demolished, listless and morose. Their state clearly wasn't only about their hangovers. They'd reached the end of their tethers about the situation. "Where's Chertang?" she asked. "Screwing his girlfriend," Pamuk replied.
"As usual,"
someone added. "I'm surprised he hasn't worn it off," said someone else, eliciting a half-hearted chuckle from the room. "It isn't like you didn't get your chance," Pamuk said. The speaker shrugged. "What's the point? The women here only want one thing. I don't want to be used. I'm more than a piece of meat, you know." This brought louder laughter. "Where have you been?" Pamuk asked her. "Buddying up with the enemy again?" She seemed to be only partly joking. "Hey, come on," Carina retorted. "You don't really think I'm going over to their side, do you? You aren't here most of the time. Where were you last night when we were partying? And where did you go today? You haven't told us yet." "I was with Rano last night, and we went to the other zone today." How much should she tell them? The Mercs were in a precarious state, on the edge of doing something rash and likely to get them killed. The news that the Sotlozans had severely hurt Bryce might set them off. "He asked me to speak to a Merc who was having a hard time." "Who did you see?" asked Pamuk, sitting up. Carina picked a missing Merc at random. "Carl, but he didn't want to talk to me, not with Rano hanging around." "I don't blame him," Pamuk said. "How did he look?" "Fine. I think everyone over there is just getting impatient, the same as here. But we need to wait a little while longer. We're working on things. I can't say more." The fact that the Sotlozans might be listening in was a handy cover for her lack of ideas or updates. "As soon as you need us, let us know." "I will." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Chertang returned. A roar of jeering and laughter went up in the lounge. She left the Mercs to their fun. Rano took her to a holo show. The scene was a setting from the Origin planet, and it was pretty realistic. They seemed to be in a forest. Trees and undergrowth surrounded the path they followed. The air was fragrant and moist and filled with the sound of running water from an invisible waterfall.
This is one of my favourites. I paid to get the place to ourselves. I hope you like it.
It's nice. She caught his disappointed look. I mean, it's really beautiful. His features brightened.
If we follow this path, it takes us to a lookout.
They ascended the trail.
Are you feeling better now? After our visit to Grantha, I mean.
Did you speak to their security chief?
I did, and she apologised. She said the officers responsible will be disciplined.
Carina wasn't sure she believed him. Then again, she was a liar too. She had lied to the black dogs for expediency's sake. So my friend will be treated better now?
Absolutely. And he's predicted to make a full recovery.
That does make me feel better. He reached for her hand and she didn't resist, though his touch made her skin crawl. The trail turned right and ended at a ledge with a guardrail. The view was spectacular, and not at all representative of their short climb. They appeared to be hundreds of meters high. A lush green canopy spread out in front of them, undulating on the uneven ground, and also as a gentle breeze swept through it. Steam rose from the treetops, and brightly coloured birds flitted from branch to branch.
It's quite something, isn't it?
It is. She recalled seeing something similar on a planet she'd visited in her Merc days, but she hadn't been able to stick around for long.
Carina.
He took her shoulders and turned her to face him.
I think you're quite something too.
Do you? She steeled herself for what was to come. As he kissed her, she willed her body not to stiffen, forced her hands not to shove him into the abyss. She was nauseated to her core, but she couldn't show it. Finally, it was over. He put an arm around her shoulders and they stood together, taking in the view.
I can't tell you how much tonight means to me. You'll never regret it, I promise.
I know I won't. As they drove back to the hotel, she said, "Can I ask you something that's been bothering me for a while? I don't mind if you can't tell me."
We'll only find out if you ask.
I've been wondering about the attraction beam that brought my ship here. It must be immensely powerful. How does Sotloza generate so much energy? He glanced at her and appeared to mentally debate with himself.
It isn't a big secret. All our energy comes from a solar array deep in space. The power runs the planet and can be used to create and sustain the beam. Does that answer your question?
It does, thanks. It's pretty simple. I've heard of other planets using similar systems, though not to such a great extent.
Here on Sotloza we've had to be very inventive and adaptable to survive. If only the rest of the galaxy knew about us, we'd be famous.
If the rest of the galaxy knew what you were doing, you'd be wiped from the star map. He dropped her off with a promise to arrange another activity tomorrow night. Carina mustered as much enthusiasm as she could as she agreed, secretly hoping she wouldn't have to continue faking it much longer. At some point, probably fairly soon, Rano would expect her to take a step she wasn't prepared to take. Chertang was alone in the lounge. Where is everyone? They were all invited to another dinner party. You didn't get an invitation?
No, like you, I'm already taken.
He smirked. How are things going?
Good, really good.
If they ever got the chance, would he even want to leave the planet? She wasn't sure. Come here. He patted the seat beside him. Cautiously, she sat down. He leaned close. She leaned away. What are you doing?
Stop kidding around. I want to tell you something.
Okay. He put his lips close to her ear.
I found out something important. The planet and the attraction beam that dragged the Bathsheba in are powered by a massive solar array.
I know.
You do? Damn, I thought I discovered something important.
It is important. I only found that out myself today. Chertang, did your girlfriend tell you about the array?
Of course. Why else do you think I'm seeing her?
I didn't get the impression you were mining her for secrets.
Not at first, maybe. But then I realized what a perfect position I was in. Her family are right up there.
They don't mind that you let a bunch of burglars into their house?
Meh, I got Cheapy to cover for me. She told them she left the door open by mistake.
He was certainly full of surprises. Cool. Let me know what else you find out. Chapter 31. 3 days had dragged by, and Carina was no closer to getting her family and companions off Sot Loza, or retaking the Bathsheba. She had learned so much intel through one means or another, but her knowledge was useless. What was needed was a shift in the power balance, or an in she could exploit. At the moment their captors held all the cards, and she was fast losing hope that things might change. Everyone seemed to sense it. The usual banter between the black dogs had dried to a trickle. They took out their frustration on the things around them and each other, getting in each other's faces and starting fights just for the hell of it. Chertang was rarely at the hotel and seemed to have moved in full time with his girlfriend. Rano was becoming insistently physical. It was hard to keep him on a string, reeling him in when he began to give up on her, yet dangling him loosely when his attentions grew too much to bear. She had seen others play that game over the years, but she was no expert in it herself. Things could not continue as they were. Something had to give. She had a horrible feeling it would be the mercs. Then, on the morning of the 4th day after her visit to Grantha, everything kicked off. She woke to unusual sounds of activity. She was often the first to wake, the black dogs often lounging in their beds until midday or later. But this morning Pamuk was already up and gone from the room. Noises were coming from the corridor. Determined footsteps, banging, shouts and laughter. What was going on? She got up, rubbing her eyes, and padded to the door. As she opened it, a merc marched purposefully by. He looked oddly bulkier than she remembered, as if his muscles had expanded overnight. "Hey, what's happening?" He turned and slowed his pace, but didn't stop.
Carina, you better ask Pamuk."
He ran down the stairs. As she watched, she realized why he looked odd. He was wearing many layers of the yellow outsider suits.
What the?
She trotted to the head of the stairs and peered down. Mercs were moving around on the first floor. "Pamuk? Is Pamuk there?" When no reply came, she descended, barefoot and cursing. All the black dogs were dressed in the bizarre many-layered costumes. Several were already sweating heavily. In the underground world's mild temperatures, one set of clothing was plenty for staying warm. It was only when she spotted someone carrying a kitchen knife the penny dropped. Shit! Stop! Everyone stop what you're doing right now! Put everything down and come into the lounge so we can talk about this. The mercs had piled on all the clothes they could wear as a poor form of body armor, and now they were gathering objects they could use as weapons. "The time for talking's over," said Pamuk, emerging from the bustling men and women. "Now it's time to act. Whatever it is you plan on doing, it isn't going to work. You're all going to get yourselves killed. If we stay here, we're already dead. What difference does it make?" "Yeah," someone remarked. "I'd rather go out now than in 20 years when the tumours get me. And after I've fathered 1,000 bastards who'll die the same way. This is better by a long shot." "We can still get out of here safely," Carina protested. "Don't throw everything away when we're so close." Pamuk thrust her face into Carina's. "Tell us the plan and we'll stop, here and now. Right, guys?" The movement around her ceased. Carina swallowed. You know I can't do that. Bullshit. Look, it's nothing personal. I like you, even though you're a shitty roommate. But you've been stringing us along for weeks with your promises of a way to get out of here. We've been screwed ever since we arrived. We just didn't know it. We should have called it quits after we broke into the mansion. It's time to do what needs to be done.
This is so senseless. There's always hope, always.
You don't get it, do you? It's different for you. You have people you want to see again, people you want to stay alive for. We don't. Carina scanned the faces surrounding her.
That isn't true. You have all the other black dogs and you have me. I don't want to lose any of you. We've been through so much together, too much to give up so easily.
We're not giving up, said Pamuk. We're taking back control.
No, you're not. This is dumb. Look at you all. How long do you think you're going to last wearing 5 banana suits and wielding chair legs? Come on, see sense.
They ignored her and continued to gather their supplies. I won't let you do it, Carina announced, running to the exit. She stood in front of it defiantly, a hand on each side of the frame. I won't let you leave. Oh, said Pamuk, with only a touch of sarcasm. She's so cute. In another few minutes the mercs had finished their preparations. Carina hadn't changed position. She wasn't going to let them out. You still here? Pamuk asked as they came face to face again. I'll fight you, Carina said. Every one of you. The mercs chuckled. You know you don't mean that, said Pamuk. Reaching out, she picked Carina up under her armpits, moved her to one side and gently set her down. Let's go, she said over her shoulder, and the party of black dogs jogged down the outer steps. Carina ran after them. Where are you going? At least tell me that. Maybe I can help you. Pamuk frowned. You're not going to tell that security chief? Of course not. All right, well, we're going to take the elevator to the surface, steal a shuttle, fly to the Bathsheba and take back the ship. You're welcome to come along.
That's insane.
You'll never make it. Pamuk shrugged and joined the rest of the mercs who were moving away. Carina caught up to her. What about the rest of the black dogs? Aren't you going to try to rescue them? They had their chance, same as us. If we could help them, we would. They'll understand. Cursing, Carina halted. There was nothing she could say or do to change their minds. She became aware she was barefoot and in pyjamas, attracting as much attention as the group of mercs. She raced back to the hotel, bounded up to her room and threw on clothes and boots before running downstairs again. When she reached the street, the black dogs were out of sight. She sped after them. She hadn't been back to the spot where she'd entered underground Sotloza since she'd arrived. She recalled the doors that led out onto the street where the transport had been waiting. No signs marked the portal, the place where outsiders were brought to begin their journey of assimilation. How many captives had arrived here and at similar places in the 2 other zones? How many lives had the Sotlozans destroyed in their quest to ensure their world's survival? 1 was too many. Yet it had to have been thousands, if not tens of thousands, over the centuries. Were the black dogs the only ones who had made a stand? She would never know. But what did seem certain, as she gazed at the mercs forcing their way in the doors, was these were determined to succeed or die trying. They must have reached them before anyone realized what they were attempting. A wedged chair leg was preventing the doors from closing, and a pitched battle was going on inside and outside between the mercs and guards. 1 black dog was already down, hit by pulse fire. The suits of others were blackened and smouldering from rounds that had grazed them. Pedestrians were fleeing the scene, though some hung around in horrified fascination. Flashes of fire cut across the gap between the doors from the firefight going on within. Pamuk emerged, armed. Swinging from left to right, she took out the Sotlosen guards. The mercs seized their rifles and someone grabbed the downed merc, hauling him inside the building. The fighting going on within seemed to be over. Could the black dogs really make it to the surface? A rumble distracted Carina. A military transport had appeared at the end of the street. Another approached from the other side. Each vehicle held at least 20 personnel. 40 soldiers. She darted across the road and ran between the wedged doors. A round passed close by her head, momentarily blinding her. "Shit, Carina," Pamuk admonished. "Next time holler before you run in. You decided to join us after all. 40 hostiles will be crawling up your asses in about half a minute. Can you get into the elevator?" "Not yet. We can't get through this goddamn door." All the black dogs were jammed into the lobby, dead and dying guards at their feet. The defenders had managed to seal the inner door during the initial attack. Someone had a pulse rifle trained on it, filling the air with choking smoke as the energy melted the surface. But the chances of burning through the door in the next 30 seconds were slim. "You've had a good run, guys," Carina said. "If you surrender now, you'll live to fight another day." Pamuk cuffed her and leaned in close. "Don't ever let me hear you say that again." She turned to her comrades. "We make our stand here." The black dogs knelt or stood as they saw fit, rifles at the ready. Carina couldn't leave them, though it would save her life. Though she might see Bryce and her brothers and sisters again, everything in her rebelled against walking away from these men and women who had fought on her behalf so bravely and for so long. She picked up a rifle and waited. Chapter 32. They'd put the least badly wounded in a group cell. Carina lay on the bare floor, resting on her back to keep a distance between her wound and the hard surface. She was better off than many. She'd only taken a hit to her shoulder, forcing her hands to open and her rifle to fall from her paralyzed fingers. Mads, Burkan and Ola, who occupied the cell with her, also had non-life-threatening wounds, though no doubt they were painful. No one spoke. The others could be asleep, but she doubted it. Sleep didn't come easily when your body was burned and blistered. But it wasn't only discomfort keeping her awake. It was the realization it was over. In response to the latest outrage, the Sotlosens had taken off the gloves. The soldiers who had attacked the mercs at the elevator site hadn't used their customary restraint. They'd sprayed the lobby with fire, putting an end to the escape attempt in less than a minute. She didn't know who had survived, if there were any more still living than her and her cellmates. The soldiers had roughly dragged them out without checking them over. She had been one of the few who had tried to crawl away before being seized and brought here. Then nothing. They'd been left without medical treatment, food or water for hours. No one even passed by the cell. The message was clear. This latest set of outsiders was now no more than farm animals. They would be allowed to live, but only because their bodies contained cells that were rare and valuable in this doomed, toxic world. She had lost all credibility with Rano's shelter. He would know she'd been messing with him all along. He would never contact her again. That was no great loss. In fact, the knowledge she would never see his face again or feel his disgusting hands on her was a relief. She shouldn't have listened to Jackson. All his talk of playing the long game had come to nothing. They should have fought back with everything they had from the moment the Sotlosens had latched onto them and taken out as many of the bastards as they could. They would have been beaten for sure. The enemy had developed unusual, powerful technologies during their years of separation from the rest of the galaxy. The Bathsheba didn't have the power to break away from their attraction beam, nor could she fight off several ships at once. Jackson had been right that resistance would have ended in disaster, but they would have all been together at the end. They would have not wound up as slaves, used for breeding like beasts. The Sotlozans were no better than the Regions. They were worse, in fact. At least the Regions sedated their victims. The lights went out. Still, their captors hadn't acknowledged their presence, so they were expected to sleep now, in pain, hungry and thirsty. To her left, someone groaned. If only she could help him, but she was impotent, useless. She would never see Bryce again, never know if he'd recovered from his injuries, never know if he was safe. She would never see her siblings either. There would be no more bickering with Parthenia, no more of Fern and Oriana's fashion shows, no brilliant revelations from Nala, and she would never feel sweet Darius's arms around her neck. She put a hand to her face, ashamed even in the darkness, as silent tears slipped from her eyes and ran into her hair. Heaving a wretched sigh, she tried to will herself to sleep, seeking oblivion. After a while, she managed to slip into a light doze. Something had changed. Her eyes opened. The cell remained dark, the breathing of her companions loud in the silence. Not all were asleep. One inhaled and exhaled with effort, as if in pain. Was that what had disturbed her? She sat up. Perhaps if she screamed and hollered enough, she could force the guards to get the merc treatment. "Mads?" she whispered. "Mads? Is that you? Are you okay?" "Carina!" a voice hissed. "Where are you?" It was not Mads who had answered. The voice she'd heard made her wonder if she was still asleep. Had she dreamt it? It couldn't be true. "Parthenia! You are here!" her sister answered. There was the sound of movement. Carina got to her feet and reached out, hardly believing this was real. Her hand brushed clothing. Parthenia touched her elbow. In another second, they hugged. Carina winced and gasped. "You're hurt," Parthenia whispered. "I'm so sorry." "No, it's fine." Adjusting her position, she hugged her sister again, fresh tears spilling out. "Are you really here? I'm not imagining it." "I'm here." Parthenia softly chuckled. "I'm really here. I can't believe it either. I've missed you so much."
"What's going on?" asked Mads. "Who's that? Who are you talking to, Lin?"
"Shh," she told him. "Be quiet. We might be able to get you out." "Take this," Parthenia said, feeling down her arm and then pushing a bottle into her hand. It felt comfortingly, reassuringly full. "You don't need it. We have more, lots more. Thank the stars." Maybe their ordeal would soon be over. Carina unfastened her shirt and put the bottle inside before buttoning it up again. "And take these," Parthenia said. She gave her an assortment of small objects. There was no need for her to explain. They were all things their siblings had handled, items that would allow Carina to locate them. She had carried similar things with her when she had been taken from the Bathsheba, but she had been forced to throw them away, severing her from her family. "Is there something of Bryce's here?" she asked, not sure she wanted to hear the answer. "The piece of gauze is his. We cut it from one of his dressings." Carina breathed in sharply. "He's okay," Parthenia said. "Oriana healed him, and we have him hidden at our house." Chapter 33. As Bryce had stared at the law enforcement vehicles waiting near the rear entrance of the museum, ages seemed to pass, though it was probably only seconds, before he finally figured out what to do. He'd picked a vehicle and run toward it.
Help! There's been a break-in. Someone's attacked the guard. Please, help!
2 officers climbed out. "We got an alert a few minutes ago. Do you know what happened?"
I saw the window at the front was broken, and I thought thieves must have broken in. When I looked inside, I saw 2 men beating up the guard. I didn't have my comm with me, so I ran in to help him, but the men took off. I followed them to this exit. Did you see them?"
"No, we only just got here."
"Maybe the other officers did,"
Bryce said, edging away.
"Anyway, you seem to have the situation under control."
"What did the men look like?"
It was hard to see. It's really dark in there. You'd better check on the guard. He looked in bad shape."
He began to walk off. "Wait, we need you to give a statement about what you saw. What's your name?" The other officer was murmuring into his comm button.
"Cradle,"
Bryce replied.
"Look, can I drop by tomorrow to give a statement? Only I'm already late, and my—"
"Cradle? What kind of stupid name is that?" The man moved closer and peered at him, then wrinkled his nose.
"You should probably focus on catching those thieves. I promise I'll—"
"Hey, where do you think you're going?" Bryce had stepped backward and turned.
"Sorry, I really have to go."
"Get back here!" He ran. Cradle? What the hell had he been thinking? He had no ID, and a quick check of their database would tell the officers no one with that dumb name existed. "It's him, damn it!" one of the officers exclaimed. "It was him all along!" Bryce flew down the road. Due to his long wanderings on his quest to locate the museum, he knew the area well. A busy shopping district, it was a maze of small streets and alleys. He darted down the first opening he saw. A flash of light and hiss burst behind him. Yells and running footsteps followed. He dashed past an alley and took the next, hoping to confuse his pursuers. But the night was quiet, and it was impossible to disguise the noise of his movements. Before he reached the end, he heard someone enter the alley behind him.
"He's here! This way!"
Bryce sped up. He ran like his life depended on it, and perhaps it did. If he was caught, he would never be allowed out again, and the kids would never get what they needed to set everyone free. He'd barely eaten for 4 days. He'd slept rough for 4 nights, and he'd spent hours crouched in darkness, waiting. He was already cramped, sore, and exhausted, but he had to squeeze out the remainder of his strength. It was the last chance they had. He swerved into a lane, sped to the end, turned right into the rear entrances of a set of shops, vaulted a low fence, hesitated, and then went left. He was moving so fast he was becoming disoriented, and all the while his pursuer was on his tail. Which way was it to the kids' house? He couldn't remember. This place looked unfamiliar. He was lost. A major road appeared ahead. Even at this late hour, vehicles passed up and down it. He knew where he was. But running up the road would lead to him getting caught. He would be too easy to spot. He dashed around the corner and instantly halted, his chest heaving. Pressing his back against the wall, he tried to quieten his panting without much success. His lungs were aflame. Aside from the vehicles, the road was empty. The officer ran out. Bryce grabbed him, shoved him down, and kneed him in the face. Then he threw the man against the wall. As he hit the ground, he kicked him in the head. After quickly checking he was out, Bryce shot up the road. The vehicle occupants would wonder who was this strange man in such a hurry, but he couldn't help it. If he could just evade capture a few more minutes. Where was the turnoff? That street? No. That one? No. There! A vehicle slammed to a halt next to him. Bryce tried to force more speed from his legs, but they had nothing left to give. The vehicle doors opened and slammed. Pulse fire exploded on the wall. They hadn't even given him a warning. They had to know he'd hurt one of their own. He rounded the turning into the kids' street. Just let him get another 50 meters. 4 houses. Just 4 houses. He felt for the spindle in his shirt. As he'd been running, it had rubbed against his chest. His hand encountered warm wetness and mangled skin. In his flight, he hadn't even noticed. He took the spindle out. 3 houses. Heated light splashed against a fence, sending out furious hisses. 2 houses. Pain roared from the back of his thigh. He stumbled. 1. As he fell, he launched the spindle in a high arc. It sailed through the night, barely visible, and disappeared. At the same time, another pulse round hit him in the back. His howl of agony was cut short as his face smacked into the ground. His nose broke and his gums split open on his teeth. Boots pounded the pavement and stopped next to him. "You're under arrest," a voice barked. There was a grunt and someone kicked him in the ribs. "Stop resisting," the voice commanded. Another kick. He jerked into a ball, his arms over his head. "I said, stop resisting." Another kick. The kicks kept coming until he slipped into a deep black void. Chapter 34. As she waited through the night, Carina's hand kept creeping to the elixir bottle in her shirt, seeking out its comforting reality. She still couldn't quite believe Parthenia had been here in the cell with her. The bottle was the only firm evidence she had, that and Mad's memory of their whispered conversation in the dark. But no, she was forgetting something. She was also healthy again and free of pain. Her first cast since leaving the Bathsheba weeks ago had been to heal herself, Mads, and the sleeping mercs. They would have a pleasant surprise when they awoke, 2 pleasant surprises. Not only would they find themselves miraculously better, they would discover they were about to take part in an escape plan. The temptation to return with Parthenia to Grantha had been great. She would have given a lot, risked a lot, to see the rest of her siblings and to reassure herself with her own eyes that Bryce had been healed too, even if she could only see him for a few minutes. But her sister had explained that the house she was living in was heavily guarded, and their numbers had increased since the children helped Bryce to escape. Parthenia had been pretending to take a bath while on her visit to Carina, and to transport her to the house, even for a few moments, was too dangerous. After hearing the commotion of the law enforcement officers beating Bryce up outside and finding the piece of wood he'd stolen for them in the yard, it had taken them days and a great deal of ingenuity to create elixir under the guards' noses. Ava had helped with the subterfuge by telling them that, in her culture, her baby had reached a milestone that had to be celebrated by bathing it in a special holy liquid. Apart from setting her free, Parthenia had said, the guards will do anything for Ava. They used to have a soft spot for Darius as well, because he's the youngest, I suppose. But they don't trust him now. Not since he faked breaking his leg. Faked breaking his leg? I can explain later. We need to figure out how we're going to do this. There was a lot. The black dogs and Ava's companions, the other women from Marchon, were spread out across Sotloza. They had to locate and free them all. Then they had to get the Bathsheba back under their control. Finally, they had to leave the system, free from the threat of the attraction beam. A bonus action would be preventing the Sotlozans from continuing their barbaric custom. So much to do, and each step brought risks. The kids had a plentiful supply of elixir, but sooner or later the enemy would cotton on to what was happening. Though they wouldn't understand casting completely, they would spot its weaknesses, such as the time it took and the need for the special beverage. The mages had to keep them guessing as long as possible. Carina adjusted her position. Mads had gone to sleep, true to his pragmatic merc nature, but she could not. As the night passed, she mentally went over the details she'd agreed with Parthenia. trying to anticipate problems before they arose. By the time she heard distant sounds of movement, hinting it was early morning and the prison was waking up, tension and fatigue riddled her. Mads turned onto his back and stretched his arms out. "About time," she murmured. "How can you sleep in a situation like this?" "I sleep the sleep of the innocent." "Ha, funny. Wake up Birkan and Ola." The cell remained dark. She heard him call to their companions, who had slumbered heavily since being healed. "Rise and shine," Mads said, no doubt roughly shaking them. "It's time to go." The mercs responded with grumbles and grunts. Ola said sleepily, "Go where?" "Grantha," Carina replied. "Only we have a few things to do first." When everyone was fully awake, she outlined the plan. Then she took out the elixir bottle and removed the lid. "Hold on," said Birkan. "I'm not sure about this. Can you explain how we get outside the cell?" "I transport you." "I would unlock it, but that could trigger the alarm." "Don't worry, it doesn't hurt. You won't feel a thing." "But I'm not a mage." "You don't have to be a mage, stupid. I can transport objects too." "But I'm not an object either." "Come on," said Mads. "You've been around Carina and the kids long enough to realize they know what they're doing." "Well, you know," said Carina, "there is another option." "What's that?" asked Birkan eagerly. "I leave you here. You pick. Ola, Mads, you're going first." She swallowed elixir, closed her eyes, and cast. When she opened her eyes, she tapped the cell door. An answering knock came. "Made up your mind?" she asked Birkan. "Shit, just do it." "But I swear, Carina." She ignored him, already casting. She was in the passageway outside the cell with the 3 mercs. This area was lit. "I just realized," said Ola. "I don't hurt anymore. Did you do that?" "Yeah, but save your thanks. We have work to do." It was impossible to tell if there were more black dogs in the surrounding cells without transporting inside them to check. The doors had no windows, and they couldn't access the data using the security panels on the wall. She guessed the surviving mercs were elsewhere, receiving medical treatment. Everyone at the elevator lobby except her group had been in bad shape, possibly dead. She didn't want to waste elixir looking in every cell, just in case she was wrong. They had a different target. The door at the end of the passageway was locked, but this one had a window. On the other side was a stairwell going up and down. It appeared empty. Whatever early morning noises had filtered through to Carina a few minutes earlier had now ceased. "They'll be upstairs," said Mads. "The guards always take the best spots." Another 2 swallows of elixir, and all 4 of them were on the other side of the door. "What happens if you use all that stuff up?" whispered Birkan. "If we don't make it, my sister will find me and bring me more." "How?" Carina frowned at him. "Shut up," Mads hissed. "This way." He crept up the stairs. Carina followed with Ola. Birkan brought up the rear. They had to climb 3 flights before they reached something other than passageways and cells. Mads crouched beside the door and pointed at it, then held up 4 fingers. 4 guards? It was a lot for them to take on unarmed, but they had a fantastic advantage. Carina was confident the Sot Lozans had never experienced a vengeful black dog appearing from nowhere before. "Can you do all 4 of us at once?" Mads asked softly. "I can try." The trick was being able to join them in her mind and transport things of this kind rather than individuals. Everyone was wearing their dumb banana suits, torn, scorched and bloody, but essentially the same. That would help. "What happens if it doesn't work?" Birkan asked. "You stay here forever." "Just me?" Shaking her head, she unscrewed the elixir bottle lid. Then she paused. If she could see the guards through the window, there weren't many casts that could hurt people. Most of the banal ones, like lock or clear, would have no effect on them. The one that could kill, Split, was excruciating and horrible to witness. On the other hand, there was Enthrall. She gestured for Mads to move out of the way. Peeking through the window, she noted each guard. One sat at a desk, another lounged against a wall. The other two were consulting a wall interface. She could divide Enthrall into 4 at a pinch, but it would weaken the cast. Perhaps so much it would be ineffective, especially if one of them was particularly strong-willed. Instead, she targeted Deskman. His eyes took on the characteristic glazed look. She pressed her face against the window and waved to attract his attention. "What are you doing?" Burkhan demanded. The guard had seen her, but his face betrayed no reaction. She beckoned. Automaton-like, he got to his feet and tottered toward the door. The lounging guard noticed. His voice muffled by the barrier, he said, "Father, what are you doing?" Father had reached the door and was already obeying Carina's gesture to unlock it. "Father!" The mercs burst into the room. Mads rushed the noisy one, slamming a fist into the man's jaw and felling him. Burkhan and Ola went for the two at the interface, barreling into them before they could raise the alarm. Blows from their own rifle butts sent them into the same nirvana as Mads' target. Father had watched the proceedings slack-jawed. Carina took his handgun. "How long will he stay like that?" Ola asked. "It's hard to tell. Depends on his personality." "Let's get them all into a cell, fast," said Mads. "Yeah," Carina agreed. "Then it's on to our next stop." Chapter 35. It would still be night-time in Grantha, though it was morning here. Now they had 2 rifles and 2 beamers. It was time to go to her family. Carina took out the bracelet Nala had fashioned for Parthenia from packaging. After wearing it for several days, her oldest sister would have imbued it with her signature. Carina located her in the vast grey expanse in the casting mind. For safety's sake, she sent Mads and Ola first, rather than attempting to transport all of them that distance at once. Now it was her and Burkhan's turn. As she took his arm, he opened his mouth to speak. "I swear," she said, "one more word." His lips snapped shut. Another mouthful of elixir and she was back in darkness. Except this darkness was warm and comforting. She could sense her sibling's presence and see her shadowy form. Parthenia's arms wrapped around her and she whispered, "You made it!" "You're here! You're here!" squeaked a voice. "Darius?" The little boy grabbed her around the waist and he buried his head in her stomach. "I thought I might never see you again." "Me too, but I'm here now. Everything's going to be okay. Are Mads and Ola here?" She could already see Burkhan's bulky form next to her. "They're over there, by my bed," Parthenia replied. "I thought I'd better move away before you cast again, so everyone didn't bump into each other. We can't make too much noise, or someone will come in to check on me." "Where are the others?" Carina asked. "And where's Bryce?" "The twins and Nala are in the bedroom next door. They know what's happening, but not when exactly, because we couldn't set a time. They might be asleep. Bryce is still in his hiding place in the roof. I couldn't speak to him at all yesterday after we hid him, so he doesn't know what's going on." "Can I go up there?" asked Carina. "You could transport into it, though the space is very cramped. We can't risk anyone going out into the main part of the house yet. Guards are on watch all day and night." Mads growled softly. "Get the ball rolling." Carina said, "We do everything in order, and that means waiting for dawn. Except I really want to see Bryce, and he should be in on this too. I'm going up there. Wait for me." She had never known the transport cast to land anyone within a solid structure, and she vaguely remembered Nine-Eye telling her it wouldn't, that if the transported wouldn't fit in the available space, then it simply wouldn't work. Nevertheless, a little anxiety nagged at her. It was not enough to overcome her need to see Bryce, however. Something was digging into her back and her legs were tightly wedged. She breathed a quiet groan of discomfort. Again she was in darkness, but this time she was surrounded by boxes. Something else, soft and warm, lay against her body, breathing gently. She touched him. "Bryce, wake up!"
"Who's?"
he murmured.
"Carina? Is that really you?"
"It's me. I can't move, though. Can you help me?"
"We're right under the eaves. Wait a sec."
He felt down her legs and grabbed her calf, helping her to wriggle one leg and then the other free. "This is insane," she said as they cuddled. "How long have you been here?"
"Only a day. Parthenia arrived in my hospital room last night."
"Are you really okay?" She felt his face, gently running her fingertips over his features. The swelling seemed to have gone down.
"I'm 100% better. Oriana did a great job healing me."
"But it must have hurt so much before the kids helped you. How did it happen?"
"It was revenge for something I did. It doesn't matter now. It was worth it to get the kids the wood they needed. Stars, I've missed you."
He pulled her close and kissed her.
"Are you okay? I've been so worried about you. Has anyone hurt you or operated on you?"
"Operated on me? No, nothing like that. The Sot Lozans went easy on us. Or they did until the black dogs got tired of waiting and tried to get to the surface. I thought you were being treated the same."
"It sounds like our experiences were different. The only black dog I've seen since the attack on the ship is Reese. As far as I know, he's still imprisoned, and so are the other mercs, while the Sot Lozans experiment on them."
"What the hell?" She tried to square Bryce's report with Rano Shelter whining and dining her. She couldn't. He'd said that the zones didn't treat outsiders the same, but it sounded like the rest of the Bathsheba's personnel had been subjected to some very dark shit.
"It's bad, Carina, especially for the women. We have to help them."
"We will, as soon as we can, but we can't rush anything or we'll screw up."
"I know. Step by step. As soon as you need me, I'll be ready."
She held him close, aware that if things didn't go according to plan, this might be her last opportunity. He murmured in her ear,
"That was smart thinking of you to push some strands of your hair into my hand at the hospital."
"You were so badly hurt I didn't know if you would even notice. I only thought of it when I recognized you. I didn't know who I was coming to see. All I'd been told was I was supposed to speak to a merc who had been acting out. If it hadn't been you, I doubt anyone else would have understood what I was doing. And of course, I didn't know if you would see the kids or be able to give them my hair so they could locate me." She added quietly, "Bryce, Vigo's dead."
"No. How? I thought you said you were treated well."
"It was a stupid accident. We were trying to steal something we thought was made of wood. It turned out we were wrong. Vigo got shot because they didn't see his outsider clothes in the darkness."
"Outsider clothes?"
"Gee, our time here has been really different."
"Not for much longer."
"From now on, we stick together, whatever happens." He kissed her again.
"Whatever happens."
"Carina?" Parthenia was sending to her. "What is it?" "We can hear the new guards arriving. They'll be taking over from the others soon, and someone will look into my room to check on me. I've hidden the mercs in the closet, but there's no more room in there. Don't come down until I tell you it's safe." "Got it."
"Who are you talking to?"
Bryce asked. He'd learned how to tell when she was mentally conversing with her siblings. "Parthenia. We have to stay here a little while longer. Then we act." Chapter 36. What Carina really wanted to do to the Sot Lozan guards was to hurt them. She wanted to punish someone for Vigo's death, Bryce's beating, the injuries and possible killings of the mercs who had tried to escape, and for whatever other terrible things the people of this vile planet had done. Someone should suffer and pay the price of their evil acts. But she knew it was her pain and anger talking. Sot Loza had brought out a side of her she didn't like and wanted to forget. Besides, hurting the guards would upset the kids, and any shouts or cries of pain might alert passers-by. Ava was also against violence. Gentle, sweet Ava, a steady, calm presence in the children's lives ever since they'd been taken from the ship, had objected. Carina found she couldn't look into the woman's soulful, pleading eyes and argue for a vengeful payback. As soon as the usual rounds of checks by the incoming guards was over, Carina had transported back to Parthenia's room, this time with Bryce in tow. He had stretched luxuriously after his long incarceration in the cramped space. Then it had been a matter of waking the other children and Ava, though everyone was careful to not wake the baby, and holding a brief conference in Parthenia and Darius's room to decide their next steps. When they'd agreed exactly what to do, Darius had walked out into the living area, rubbing his eyes. Nala, peeking out with Carina, quietly giggled. "Morning, kid," said a guard, lounging on the sofa. "How'd you sleep?"
Okay."
Darius walked past the man into the kitchen, where he poured himself a drink from a jug on the counter. The guard stood up. "What's that you're drinking? Is it something good?"
Darius replied, shaking his head.
"Then why you drinking it? Don't you want... What's wrong?" Darius had closed his eyes and was clearly concentrating hard. "Hey, I said..." The guard had been walking toward the kitchen, but his footsteps slowed to a stop. His arms fell limply to his sides, and his jaw dropped. Darius opened his eyes and grinned.
"Got them!"
Carina cautiously stepped out of the bedroom. From her new vantage point, 2 more guards were visible, one at each exit, with similarly vacant expressions as the first. "Did you get the ones outside too?"
"I think so."
He probably had. Darius tended to underestimate the strength of his mind-blowing casts. He'd most likely not only enthralled all the guards for the next 24 hours, possibly inflicting mild though permanent brain damage, but also caught any nearby pedestrians in his blast. She'd been a little apprehensive about asking him to make the cast, worrying she or the others might fall victim to friendly fire. Fern and Oriana went into the yard and, taking the enthralled guards by the hand, led them into the house. Then the mercs relieved the guards of their weapons and pushed them into Parthenia's room, where they tied and gagged them all securely. Now it was time for part 3, to find and gather all the remaining captured personnel from the Bathsheba. This part was bound to be way more difficult. Bryce knew where Reese and presumably other black dogs were locked up, but the big question was where were the rest of the Marchonish women? After hearing Bryce's explanation of what had happened to him and Reese, Carina was deeply concerned for their safety. Nala had been plumbing the Sotlosen net for information with success. It was obvious that some of the people from the ship must have been taken to the 3rd zone on Sotlosa, Bago, and she'd discovered an area where she suspected they were being kept. "Now what?" asked Mads. Bryce replied, "Now we go break your buddies out of prison." "What buddies?" "Reese, Harlow and the rest. You know who I mean." "They're no buddies of mine," Mads replied, grinning. "Maybe we should leave them there." "I'll tell them you said that."
"Are we going to the prison now?"
Darius asked. Carina replied, "Yes, but you're staying here, remember?" It had been a hard decision to leave him and Nala in the house with only Burkan as protection, but they were unlikely to free the mercs without a firefight, and she didn't want to put the younger kids in danger. If Sotlozans discovered what had happened at the house and burst in, Darius could transport himself, Nala, Ava, her baby, and Burkan to safety.
I want to come.
It's out of the question, so don't bug me, okay? She turned to the others. Are you ready? Do we have the prison coordinates?
I can help.
Carina sighed. I know you can, but we can do this by ourselves.
I can cast heat.
She paused. I didn't think of that. What's heat? Fern asked. Have you invented another cast? His question went unanswered as Carina considered the possibilities. Darius waited for her answer.
I can stay with Ava,
Oriana offered. All right, Carina relented.
Yay!
But you stick behind me at all times, okay? Now let's do this before the Sotlozans catch on to us. She suspected the out-of-action guards and mysteriously empty cell she'd left behind had finally been discovered. The Una authorities would be checking recordings to find out what had happened. You didn't explain what Darius is talking about, said Bryce. You'll see. It was impossible to be precise about where they appeared at the prison. The ideal spot would have been within its depths near the cells. They could have released the captured mercs and transported them out of there without too much fuss. As it was, they materialized next to a set of elevators. This is the outer section, said Bryce. We need to go that way. Though the area was deserted, the sudden appearance of armed mercs and assorted children must have been immediately picked up by the prison staff. By the time they reached the lower depths, a defense of armed guards had been assembled. Carina spotted them first as she rounded a corner. A pulse round flashed past as she stepped hastily back. We know who you are, a voice shouted out. You're the outsiders who disappeared on Una. If you think you're going to rescue your friends, think again. Give yourselves up, or those kids with you might get hurt. The only ones who'll get hurt are you guys, Carina replied. We're in a hurry. Bring the prisoners out and we'll leave quietly. Not gonna happen. You'll be taken and interrogated. And believe me, you won't like it. They had to be wondering how she and the mercs had managed to move to the zone unnoticed, and how they'd appeared in the prison from nowhere. The speaker was also stalling for time. Guards would be on the way to attack them from the rear, sandwiching them in. Do your stuff, Darius, Carina said. They're about 10 meters away. The great thing about her little brother was that, despite his incredible abilities, he was never cocky. He only seemed happy to please her as he drank elixir from his flask. She hated to think what such amazing mage powers would have done to someone like their dark mage brother, Castiel. The boost to his already inflated ego would have been vast, and he wouldn't have hesitated to inflict even more horrors on the people under his control. Ah! Came a guard's cry. Shit! Damn! The space resounded with the metallic clatter of many scorching hot pulse rifles hitting the floor. When Carina peeked again, the guards were disarmed and nursing burnt hands. What do we do with them? Asked Mads as he followed her around the corner. She softly replied, Wait until the kids are out of sight and then shoot them. It wasn't revenge, she told herself, just pragmatism. We don't want them coming after us. You don't have to kill them, just incapacitate them. Ola had heard her. Feels bad to shoot someone who can't fire back. They've been keeping innocent mercs captive, Carina argued, and you should have seen what the Sotlozans did to Bryce. The guards put up a fight despite their burns, but the mercs quickly forged a safe passage for everyone with brute force and stayed behind while Carina, Bryce and the kids went ahead. Soon there was the hiss of pulse fire, shouts and cries. Then the mercs caught up. Bryce found his former cell and Carina cast unlock, revealing a surprised Reese. The mercs thumped and slapped him in their usual celebratory style, and then it was time to find more members of the band. The kids raced up and down the passages, unlocking all the doors in the vicinity, sometimes 3 or 4 at once. It was a risky tactic, considering they might be releasing dangerous Sotlosen criminals too. But now their captors knew they were facing something out of the ordinary, time was of the essence. When they'd gathered all the mercs they could find, Reese asked, "Now what? We fight our way out?" "No," Carina replied. "First you're coming with us on a little trip. Then you're going to help rescue Pamuk and the others trapped on Una." Chapter 37. Back at the kids' house, the guards remained enthralled, and no one from the Grantha authorities had turned up. But how much longer did they have before someone saw the children on the security recordings at the prison? They couldn't stay here any longer. The place was full of rescued mercs. Carina began to wonder how she would deal with them all, plus, hopefully, the ones still in Una and Bago. Her plans about what to do when everyone was rescued were hazy. "On to Una next?" Bryce asked. "Yeah, but—" She bit her lip. "You're wondering if you can transport all of us?" "Exactly. I mean, we can do it, but it'll take time. And that's not exactly helpful for a surprise attack. Also, how will we get everyone to the ship?" "I was hoping you had that part figured out." "I barely had this part figured out. Stars, this is hard. Even if they got everyone to the surface, the conditions up there were so bad they wouldn't last long. If they didn't find and fight their way aboard a shuttle fast, they would be weakened and recaptured. They would be back at square one, and the Sotlosens would know what they were dealing with regarding the mages, who would never be allowed near the ingredients to make elixir again. They'd played their trump card. Now they had to win. "We've topped up," Parthenia announced. "We have as much elixir as we can carry." "I'm ready," said Oriana. "I don't want to miss out on the action again." "Where's Pamuk and the rest of them?" asked Reese. "In another prison?" Carina shook her head. "They jumped the gun and tried to make their own escape. The ones who survived must be in a medical center." "Fuck," Reese breathed. "We can heal them, but we have to get to them first." "You know where they are?" "Not exactly, but I know someone who does." They arrived at Rano's house in batches. Carina transported in first with Bryce and Reese. She appeared in Rano's living room, site of his drunken revelations about the history of his world. The waterfall played in the window space. There was the sofa where they'd sat. There were his ornaments. It was all horribly familiar. "Whose house is this?" asked Bryce. "Una's chief of security." "You've been here before?" He knew she could only transport somewhere she'd previously visited if she didn't have specific coordinates. "I'll tell you all about it later." Parthenia arrived, 2 mercs in tow. All Carina's siblings had become better mages since leaving the Shurers. The regular meditation she'd taught them, honing their powers. Carina walked to the doorway and listened. Had Rano left for work? She wasn't sure what the time was in this zone. If he had, it would make everything more difficult. Parthenia disappeared, leaving to bring more mercs over. At the same time, Fern blinked into existence with 2 of the fighters. It was as if they were alighting from an invisible train. Still, there was no sign of Rano. She stepped to the stairs and looked up. A figure moved quickly out of sight. He must have heard them speaking. She bounded upstairs. "Bryce! Reese!" A door shut before she reached the landing. She turned on the spot. Which one had it been? Bryce and Reese came running up. "We have to find him fast before he can com anyone." She ran for one door while the men headed for the other 2. Her door slid open, and there Rano was, back to the window, his finger on his ear. His lips stopped moving and his eyes widened as she burst in. Without breaking pace, she hurled herself at him and drove her shoulder into his stomach. He crashed into the window, bounced off it, and they both slid to the floor. The heel of her hand thrust against his cheek, she held his head down as she dug into his ear with her other hand and popped out the comm. "Who were you talking to?" she demanded. "What did you tell them?"
"Carina,"
he said, his speech distorted by the pressure on his jaw.
"Who are those people?"
Bryce had walked up and stood over them, hands on hips. "You know who they are. Tell us where you put the rest of my companions, here and on Bago."
"I don't."
"Ah!" Bryce had kicked his back. A chuckle came from Rees, who stood in the doorway. "I think he might have got a comm out," Carina said.
"I know,"
said Bryce. He knelt on one knee and leaned close to Rano's ear.
"We can inflict a lot of damage on you before your friends arrive. And believe me, I'm in the mood for it. I'm the guy you came to see in hospital."
Rano's gaze roamed Bryce's face, shock permeating his features.
"How?"
"Where are the others?" Carina yelled. He closed his eyes and screwed up his face, as if bracing himself for what was to come. "You've seen something of what we can do. Arriving out of nowhere is only a part of it. Think about what else we're capable of. Think about what we'll do to those circulation fans on the surface, keeping the air moving and removing the radioactive gas if you don't let us go. Think about what we'll do to the solar array. How do you fancy living with no power, slowly roasting in radiation? Do you really want to return your civilization to its beginnings? Each day a struggle for survival? That's how it's going to be if—"
"You can't do all that."
"Do you want to find out?" Resolve seemed to ooze from his body. Perhaps he'd concluded it wasn't worth the risk, that there were more people Sotlozans could drag from space if these ones got away. He murmured a couple of names, adding,
"The first is an Unan medical center. The second is a place in Bago."
She released her hold. "Tie him up," she told Rees.
"My pleasure."
From downstairs came the noise of people moving about. The mercs and mages had continued to arrive. Picking up Rano's comm, she left Rees to deal with him and went with Bryce to talk to the mercs. The bulky men and women filled the living room and spilled out into the hallway. She outlined the situation to them, continuing, "We have a limited number of mages to help free our shipmates, and then we need to get everyone up to the Bathsheba."
"We'll steal a shuttle," said Mads.
"No need," said Parthenia. "We can use transport." "For so many?" Carina questioned. "If we do it in batches, like we did just now, we can manage it." Parthenia turned to her siblings. "Right?" Fern, Oriana, and Darius nodded enthusiastically. "You did it before, Carina," said Oriana. "After we escaped the Nightfall. You moved us all to Ostalon. I couldn't have managed a cast like that then, but I can now." "That was different. We were passing over the planet's surface, and I had to set you down randomly, not knowing where you would appear. We don't even know exactly where the Bathsheba is. If we miss our mark, whoever we're transporting will die." "I know where she is," said Nala. "Her position was the first thing I looked up when I figured out how to read the Sotlozan language." "You're amazing," Darius said, admiration shining in his eyes. She shrugged. "Honestly, it isn't very different from Universal. The ship's in geostationary orbit, or she was the last time I looked. I can check." "You're my best girl," exclaimed Carina. "Hey," Oriana objected. "You're all my best girls." Fern chuckled. "Me and Darius aren't," Carina said. "Now we just have to figure out how to comm Van Hasty, Jackson and Shao. I have to let them know we'll be there soon to help them take back the ship." Chapter 38. It was decided. Bryce would take Darius and Oriana with him to Bago, while Carina would rescue the mercs at the medical centre with Parthenia, Fern and Nala. The Black Dog split into 2 teams to go with each party. Then everyone would rendezvous on the Bathsheba as soon as their work was done. As the most powerful mage, it seemed glaringly obvious that Darius should go to Bago, where the nature of the situation was opaque. Yet Bryce was uncomfortable with taking the little boy away from Carina. She knew him best, especially his strengths and vulnerabilities. But the medical centre job was likely to be straightforward, and it made sense that Carina would be in the first group to return to the Bathsheba, when the fighting was likely to be heaviest. Though she was a mage, she had also been a black dog, and she worked well with the mercs. "They're coming!" someone shouted. Something heavy and solid hit the front door. The security chief's comm must have got through, and now his officers weren't wasting any time in coming to his rescue. Carina grabbed Bryce and kissed him. "Good luck. See you back at the ship." She took a drink of elixir, then she was gone. Another blow resounded from the door. It cracked at its hinges.
"Who should I transport first?"
Darius asked. "Mercs," Rees answered. "We'll be ready with cover when you guys arrive." Bryce nodded agreement. Darius drank from his bottle and most of the remaining black dogs disappeared.
"Wow,"
said Oriana.
"That was a lot. Now do the rest of us." "Okay."
The door shattered and jagged splinters exploded. Armed men in uniform ran in. Bryce was on a wide, dusty plain under a twilit sky. The atmosphere was cold and clammy. The mercs who had arrived before him were standing around looking confused. As soon as Rees saw Darius, he said, "You sure you got the right place, kid?"
"Uh-huh. I transported everyone exactly where Nala said."
"She must have got it wrong," said another merc. "Or that security chief lied."
"Shit," said Rees. "What are we going to do? Carina and the others will be at the medical centre by now. Should we join them or go straight to the ship?"
"We can't leave," said Bryce. "We can't just abandon all those women."
It had been clear after the prison rescue that the Sotlozans had sent half the black dogs to Una and the other half to Grantha. The Marchonish women, apart from Ava, had been sent to the third zone.
"I don't want to leave without them," said Rees. "But we don't have a choice. No one's here to give us directions."
Oriana grabbed Bryce's arm and gazed up at him tearfully.
"Those poor women. There has to be something we can do. I could send to Carina and ask her,"
Darius offered.
"She'll be busy,"
Bryce replied. They had to figure this one out themselves. He strode away from the group. One thing he'd noticed during the time he'd spent sleeping rough was that every surface not paved or decorated with artificial plants was covered in grooves, presumably marks left by the excavating machines. In this place he couldn't see any grooves. The ground appeared natural. Flat, irregular rock covered by fine dust stretched as far as he could see.
"Oh!"
Oriana, who had also wandered away from the group, had tripped and fallen. As she got to her hands and knees, she said,
"There's something here."
When Bryce joined her, she was examining a round metal plate lightly covered in dust. He squatted down for a closer look. The plate was slightly raised from the surrounding rock.
"Shit, we're at the right coordinates, but the wrong depth."
He stood up.
"This must be some kind of natural cavern."
"Then where's the light coming from?" Rees asked. Mads looked up.
"The sky shining through cracks, maybe? If it is, we need to leave, fast. This planet's hot with radiation." "That's why everyone lives underground?" asked Bryce. "It was Carina who found out. Darius, get us out of here."
Bryce pushed the edge of the plate. It moved. He pushed harder, and it slid to one side, revealing a hole with rungs leading down.
"We can get in this way."
"I don't like it," said Rees. But Oriana swung herself into the hole and began descending. Rhys spat on the ground. "What's up with the mage girl? Does she think she's invincible?" Darius followed his sister.
"I'm going after them," said Bryce. "You can do what you like, but if you want to get to the ship, you'd better stick with me and the kids."
"All right," Rhys grumbled. "I was only worried about the radiation."
"Then come down here."
The shaft descended in utter darkness. They climbed downward for about 5 minutes before reaching the bottom, where the rungs disappeared and the tunnel turned at a right angle. They began to crawl, the line of mercs shuffling and complaining in the dark. "What's this for, do you reckon?" Rhys asked. Bryce pondered.
"Escape route to the surface."
"Maybe an escape route from the surface," said Oriana. "It's very dusty, as if it hasn't been used in years." "I'm sorry I got it wrong," said Darius. "I wish I knew how deep to go. Then I could transport everyone there."
"Don't worry," said Bryce. "These goons could use some exercise."
There was a small thunk and another "Oh" from Oriana.
"I bumped my head. I think I reached the end."
"That's it?" Rhys asked. "What do we do now? Go back? I can't turn around." Oriana said,
"I can feel
A crack sounded, like a seal snapping open, and light from a widening chink flooded the tunnel. "Careful," Bryce quietly warned. Oriana's features were illuminated as she peered through the chink.
"It's a facility of some kind."
"Is there anyone around?"
"I can't see anyone. Should I climb down? There are indents in the wall."
"Let me look."
Bryce squeezed past Darius until he was alongside her and took a peek. They'd arrived at the edge of a large circular room surrounding an inner, round chamber. Everything, walls, floor and ceiling, was clinically white and brilliantly lit by bright overhead lamps. The indents in the wall Oriana had spotted were the only dusty spots in the place. The Marchonish women had to be in here, somewhere. Bryce's guess was they were inside the inner chamber. Why they were there and how they could be rescued, he wasn't sure.
"I want to go down,"
Oriana murmured plaintively.
"We should go in there and search,"
said Darius. Bryce had misgivings, but he had to agree. Something strange was going on, and the realization only increased the imperative to put a stop to it.
"I'll go first, then Rhys and Mads. Oriana and Darius, you come down after them. If we need any more mercs, I'll holler."
He lifted the hatch and leaned it against the wall. Then, holding the edges of the opening, he lowered himself through it, feeling for an indent with his toes. When he had purchase, he climbed down, lightly jumping the last meter. Rhys and Mads were soon beside him. Oriana came next. Darius's head and shoulders appeared in the space.
"You have to go feet first,"
Bryce explained. Darius frowned. He turned around and dangled his legs out of the hole, swinging them around randomly. Bryce sighed.
"Jump, and I'll catch you."
The little boy dropped, and he caught him under his armpits before setting him down and calling up quietly to tell the mercs to close the hatch. A second later, a soft swish sounded. A door had opened somewhere out of sight. There was no way of telling where the new arrival would go. Mads ran one way and everyone followed him. They huddled against the inner chamber wall as footsteps echoed nearby. Darius sipped elixir. The footsteps paused. Had the newcomer heard them? They started up again, coming closer. Mads and Rhys lifted their rifles. Darius shook his head, mouthing, "I cloaked us." Bryce pushed the muzzles down. A man appeared, his gaze sweeping the room. He looked directly at them, but didn't react. Then he walked away. There was another swish, and silence returned.
"Word must have come from Una," said Mads. "The security chief has told them to expect us."
"That man was definitely checking the area,"
Oriana agreed.
So let's find those women and get out of here before he comes back.
Bryce was already walking around the inner wall. On the outer wall, on the opposite side of the room, was the door the searcher had entered through, and facing it was the entrance to the chamber. It slid open at his approach. What he saw within made him take a step back. The door slid closed. He had glimpsed a sight that set his heart racing in horror. As Oriana and Darius neared him, he pushed them away.
Don't go in there.
Why?
Asked Darius. Ignoring him, Bryce asked Reese to wait with the kids and took Mads in with him. Beds ringed the room, and on them lay the women from Marchon, unconscious under bedsheets, drips running from their arms. His fears about human experimentation seemed to have been realized. Had the women been impregnated, or were the Sotlozans only feeding them with artificial hormones in order to harvest their eggs?
We have to detach the lines and wake them up.
He ran to the first woman.
They're out cold,
said Mads, approaching another victim.
We'll have to take them as they are. Then let's make it look like they're sleeping at least.
Over the next minute, the two men removed the medical equipment attached to the women. Bloody trails formed on the sheets, but they covered up the stains as well as they could. When they'd done their best to improve the scene, Bryce let Darius in. The little boy's big brown eyes widened until the whites showed all around.
It's time to transport everyone to the ship,
Bryce said.
Can you send the women first with some black dogs for protection?
Who knew what was going on up there? But whatever it was, it had to be better than life on Sotloza. Chapter 39.
What the hell took you so long?
Jackson demanded.
You've been gone ages.
Now isn't the time for explanations, Carina replied.
Yeah,
Van Hasty said, echoing Jackson's complaint.
Do you have any idea what it's like living for weeks on Deck Zero? Living and sleeping in an Eva suit? Every time I needed to take a dump, I had to...
Quit whining, said Shao, handing out earcoms to the new arrivals. Carina's right. Save your belly aching for later. We have a job to do. Carina nodded her thanks. Bryce and the rest of the black dog should be here soon. What's the situation? They were in the storage area, where Jackson had taken them after she'd alerted him that she was back.
Not too bad, he replied.
There are about 50 hostiles, but that's down from a couple of hundred when they took over. They spend most of their time on the bridge, though. That's where they are right now.
The bridge? All of them?
I don't know for sure. It's hard sneaking around, you know. It wasn't like Jackson to be so tetchy. His irritation had probably originated in his fears about his shipmates. The bridge was the worst place for an assault. The Sotlozan crew would have ready access to all the ship's controls, and the bridge had the best security, along with the engine room. Yet she had Parthenia and Fern with her, as well as Pamuk, now healed, and many more mercs. Plus, they knew the Bathsheba inside out, unlike the thieves who had stolen her. We can do it. It'll have to be fast and smooth, but we can do it. Afterward, we'll comb the ship for stowaways before we set off. Van Hasty asked, but what's to stop the other ships from firing on us when they know what's happening? That's why we have to be super fast. The Sotlozans now know we can transport, but it might take them a while to imagine we could travel all the way up here. If we had Darius with us, he could have enthralled them all at once, before they got a comm out. But he's with Bryce. I don't want to wait for him to arrive, so speed is the word.
Fair enough, said Jackson. Let's hit the bridge.
Carina told Nala and Ava to stay in the storage area until someone told them it was safe to come out. Maneuvering on home turf was easier than transporting around an unfamiliar planet. The mercs quickly and quietly spread out and approached the bridge from different areas of the ship. If anyone encountered a Sotlosan en route, Carina didn't hear about it. The order was shoot to kill on sight. They were taking no hostages and showing no mercy. A few minutes later, she was in the passageway leading to the bridge, repeating her plan to her siblings. Jackson, Van Hasty and Pamuk would be going in with them. She opened her elixir bottle. "Ready?" Parthenia and Fern nodded. The mercs gripped their rifles. She cast. As she opened her eyes, pulse rounds were already hissing out. The Sotlosans hadn't been slow to fire as she and the others had appeared. Perhaps they had guessed they might have unwanted visitors. Parthenia and Fern sheltered behind Van Hasty and Pamuk as instructed. She ducked behind a console. Jackson took a hit and collapsed, but there was nothing she could do. She had to cast again. She pinpointed the Sotlosans nearest her, drank elixir, wrote the enthrall character in her mind and sent it out. The hissing quietened, but not entirely. As she looked out again, a round flashed past, hitting Jackson where he sprawled on the deck. His rifle lay at his side. His attacker, the remaining non-enthralled Sotlosan, ran for the exit. Jackson weakly lifted his prosthetic arm. The forearm opened and a barrel rose up. He aimed and fired, hitting the man in the back. He fell flat on his face between the opening doors. Parthenia raced to the downed merc, gulping elixir. She might save him if she healed him before he slipped away. "Is that all of them?" Pamuk asked Van Hasty, shooting the man at the exit in the back again and finishing him off. Van Hasty appeared to be taking a mental tally of the hostiles, dead, injured and still living. "Nearly, I'd say." She calmed the other black dogs and told them to sweep the ship. Shao peeked in. "Is it all over?" "Bar the shouting," said Pamuk. She strode to a wounded woman trying to rise, put a boot on her back and pushed her down. The pilot gingerly stepped over the corpse between the doors. "What are we going to do with those?" She nodded in the vague direction of the enthralled Sotlosans. "Transport them to the surface, I suppose," said Carina. "Let them take their chances." Pamuk said, "I vote we space them. I'm not 100% against it, but as we haven't been attacked, I'm guessing they didn't manage to send a comm. Another of their ships might notice little freezing figures floating in space." "I don't think so," Pamuk countered. "Space is like really, really big." I'd noticed. Carina was wondering what had happened to Bryce. It had been some time since he'd gone to Bago with Darius and Oriana. Jackson groaned and stretched. "He's going to be okay," said Parthenia brightly. Van Hasty grimaced. "Now he's going to make us listen to his stories about what a big hero he is." "I heard that," said Jackson. "You were meant to." Carina sent out a ship-wide comm, asking if anyone had seen Bryce or anyone else they were expecting to arrive from the planet. In answer, she received a send from Oriana.
"We're back. Where are you?"
When she told her, Oriana said,
"I'll transport him to you. He wants to talk to you urgently."
When Bryce appeared, his features were pale and riven with distress.
"We have to use the obliterator on that place. Wipe it from the galaxy."
"What's wrong? What happened down there? Did you get the women?"
"We got them. They were... shit. I don't even know what they were doing to them. But we can't let them get away with it. We have to stop the Sotlosans from hurting anyone else."
A pulse round hissed. Pamuk had shot the woman under her foot. "What?" she replied to their questioning looks. "I believe him." Carina believed him too. Parthenia must have seen her expression change to grim resolve.
"You can't just kill these people in cold blood."
"If the roles were reversed," Carina replied, "what do you think they would do to you?" Her sister clutched her hands into fists.
"The roles aren't reversed. We don't have to be as bad as them. We can be better."
Bryce was shaking his head.
"You didn't see what I did. If you had, you wouldn't say that. Those people have to be stopped. I don't care how."
Carina gave Van Hasty and Pamuk a look. They understood immediately and began to herd the ambulatory Sotlozans from the bridge. Jackson got up to help them. "Where are you taking them?" Parthenia asked. "Out of your sight. The mercs would be back soon to deal with the wounded. Go and find Darius and Oriana. From the sound of it, they'll need your help tending to the Marchonish women." "But," Parthenia objected.
"They do need you,"
said Bryce. Setting her lips, she marched out with her brother. Shao was at her console. "Luckily, those assholes haven't messed things up too much, and they filled the tanks. I've reset the coordinates to Earth." "Better get over to the obliterator," said Carina. "We have a few things to do before we leave." The pilot's eyebrows rose. "You're going ahead?" "I don't think we have any choice if we want to leave with a clear conscience." She leaned on the back of Shao's chair. "They have a solar array feeding energy to the planet. Can you find it?"
Yeah, got it."
"Don't fire yet. They also have structures on the surface housing fans that keep the air underground sweet." Shao searched. "Quite a lot of structures on the surface. Hard to tell what they are. The fan housings are probably made from lead to protect the service engineers from radiation."
"Ah, yeah, that kind of information helps."
"Got them. And then there's that big bitch that towed us here. How could I miss her? She goes first, so she can't send out her beam. Then the array, and then the fans. That'll put the Sotlozans out of action for a long while, and make them think twice about what they did."
"The rest of their ships could still come after us."
"If they're dumb, they might. If they're smart, they'll concentrate on protecting their remaining resources."
"Whatever you say. Hey, shouldn't Chertang do the honors? He knows this machine better than—"
Carina slapped her forehead.
"Chertang! I forgot all about him."
Chapter 40. The noises in the dark bedroom were unmistakable. Cringing, Carina gave a small cough. The noises didn't stop. She gave a louder cough and preemptively covered her eyes with one hand. A woman gasped.
"Did you hear that? I think someone's in here."
"Someone is in here," Carina said. There was a small scream. "Chertang, I need to talk to you." She had considered simply transporting the man out of here, but the concept of free will bothered her. There was always the possibility that, despite what he'd said, Chertang might think he'd found true love. The light came on. There was another scream and the sound of rustling bedding. Carina lifted her rifle and pointed it in the direction of the rustling, peeking between her fingers. "If you try to leave, if you try to comm, I'll shoot." "Not me, I hope," said Chertang. "Even you." The pair had pulled the covers up to their chests, so Carina removed her hand from her eyes. "Chertang, we're leaving. You have now, this moment, to decide if you're staying or coming with us."
"Huh,"
said the woman haughtily.
"I don't know who you are or how you got in here, but he's my outsider and you can't have him."
"I don't particularly want him." Chertang looked hurt. "Not like that, anyway. We're about to mess this place up, badly. I'm giving you fair warning." "In that case—" He leapt out of bed and began hastily pulling on his pants.
"Where are you going?"
asked the woman.
"Don't believe her. She doesn't know what she's talking about. No one can hurt Sotloza, no one."
"I'm sorry, my love, but they really can."
"But how?"
Her gaze travelled from her lover to Carina. Something seemed to register. She announced urgently,
"I want to come with you."
Chertang picked up his shirt. Carina said. "You aren't invited."
"I'm sorry,"
Chertang repeated.
"It's been wonderful, but I have to."
The woman had grabbed him around the waist.
"Don't leave without me. I want to come too."
"Not happening," said Carina, levelling her rifle and aiming it at the woman's head. "Back off." but Chertang's girlfriend gripped tighter and moved behind his back.
"Carina!"
She winced. Darius was sending, or rather, he was blasting her mind apart with his megaphone cast.
"You have to come back immediately. Xiao says the Sot Lozans are hailing us. If we're going to fire on them, we have to do it now, or they'll get their shots in first."
"Okay, I understand. I'll be right there." "Damn it," she muttered, slinging her rifle over her back and opening her elixir bottle.
"Wait,"
said the woman.
"I changed my mind. I want to
Carina appeared on the bridge. Chertang and the woman were in the same position. His shirt was open and she was entirely naked as she clung to him. The bedclothes hadn't been included in the transport. She squeaked and tried to cover herself with her hands. Xiao stared. "Who's that?" "Don't ask." "Another pickup?" Van Hasty's tone was scornful. The woman was flushing furiously.
"How did I get here? Take me back immediately."
"Chertang," said Xiao, "glad you could make it. You might want to guide me through this." The Sot Lozans did the smart thing for once. Their energy source destroyed, their population at risk of slow suffocation and radiation poisoning. They conserved their resources and didn't send their remaining vessels after the Bathsheba. The ship's personnel spent the following weeks recuperating. Medics nursed the Marchonish women back to full health. The children returned to their usual games and antics. The Merc's banter reached new heights of obscenity when no youngsters were around, as they recounted their experiences on the strange planet. Carina grieved Vigo Justus, a good friend gone too soon. The time was approaching when the Bathsheba would be set on automatic and everyone would enter deep sleep. One day, fears overwhelming her, Carina went to the Twilight Dome to be alone for a while. Their journey so far had been dogged by bad luck. Would they even make it? And if they did reach Earth, what would the planet be like? Yet they'd come so far and at the cost of so many lives. They had to try, and not only for their own sakes. Ever since Nai had taught her about the star map and explained that it showed the origin planet of all mages, Carina had hankered to go there. As she had grown and learned about the persecution of her kind, her resolve had strengthened. Then, at the matching on Pyrene, she had met Magda, the spirit mage, and finally confirmed that Darius was a spirit mage too, born once a generation. Only these mages could bring the others together. Magda had died, and Carina had taken Darius away. Without a spirit mage, her people were lost. She had to try to find a safe home for them. "I thought you might be hiding in here," said Bryce. His arrival dissolved the anxious meanderings of her mind. She smiled. "Busted. You're escaping Chertang and Cheapy, right?" "Not particularly. Are they fighting again?" "Do they ever stop? I'm thinking maybe one or both of them should go into deep sleep earlier than the rest of us." Carina chuckled. "I'm sure Jackson can arrange it." "He might need to, or Van Hasty will provide a more permanent solution." He sat down and put his arm around her. She recalled the time he'd given her the mage love band he'd made for her. She had never taken it off. "Bryce, I hope you aren't still thinking about us having kids, because that's a long way away, if it's ever going to happen." "Kids? Don't worry. I like the ones we already have. Sot Loza kind of put me off the idea." The end. This has been Galactic Rift, Star Mage Saga Book 8, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next and final book in the Star Mage Saga is Neverwar, Star Mage Saga Book 9. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.